Fenna's integration into the settlement over the following weeks proceeded with the same patient, careful rhythm every previous arrival had known, Thessaly taking personal charge of teaching her the old forms she had never properly learned, Sable guiding her slowly toward the first tentative recognition of the bloodline gift's presence beneath her own feet, and Varen, in the quieter hours between these lessons, pursuing the thread her grandmother's fragmented account had opened with the same meticulous, patient thoroughness he had once brought to documenting House Veritha's crimes for the Council's original inquest. "It is slow work," he admitted to Rias and Eleanor one evening, several weeks into his careful investigation, spreading a modest collection of notes across the council table that carried none of the damning weight the original ledger had once provided. Fenna's grandmother left no written record, only the fragments Fenna herself carries second-hand, and house records covering minor domestic staff from 15 years ago are not exactly maintained with the same care as formal ledgers of funded atrocities. But I have found something. A pattern of household staff dismissals across several noble houses in the years immediately following the massacre, consistent with servants who witnessed something they could not live with and fled rather than report it through channels that might have exposed them to retaliation. "How many houses?" Eleanor asked. "3 that fit the pattern closely enough to warrant real suspicion," Varen said. "Though I believe I can narrow it further." Fenna's grandmother specifically described her former employer as having built considerable fortune through means she found shameful even before the massacre itself, language that suggests established wealth acquired through methods already considered questionable among the great houses, rather than simply another minor participant drawn into House Veritha's coalition for opportunistic reasons. Rias considered this with the same sharp, strategic focus she brought to every serious lead, though her expression carried a weariness Issei recognized from the long, difficult months chasing House Veritha's own crimes to their conclusion. "We just finished one reckoning," she said, not quite a complaint, simply an honest acknowledgement of the weight involved. "I do not say that to discourage pursuing this. Fenna deserves the same truth we eventually gave Eleanor, and if there is genuinely another house complicit in the massacre, they deserve exactly the same consequences House Verith faced. I only note, for all our sakes, that this kind of work never seems to arrive at a moment that feels convenient." "It rarely does," Eleanor agreed, though her voice carried a hard, familiar resolve. "But I did not build this settlement, this restoration, this entire hard-won peace, only to abandon the pursuit of truth the moment it grew inconvenient. If there is another house hiding behind 15 years of unexamined silence, I want them found, and I want Fenna to have the same chance I was given to see her people's history properly, honestly accounted for." The investigation that followed absorbed a considerable portion of the household's attention over the following months, Aquino's network once again proving invaluable in tracing the fragmented threads of Varen's suspicion through channels considerably more cautious and better hidden than House Veritha's own eventually careless trail had been. And it was Fenna herself, increasingly drawn into the investigation's careful work as her own confidence and settlement within the community grew, who ultimately provided the breakthrough that finally, definitively narrowed the search. "I remember something else," she told Varen one afternoon, several months into the patient investigation, her expression carrying the particular focus of someone finally, carefully excavating a memory she had not previously understood the significance of. "Not from my grandmother directly. From a letter she kept, hidden among her old belongings, that I only properly read after her death. It was not addressed to her. I believe she took it from her former employer's household when she fled, evidence she was too frightened to ever use but could not bring herself to destroy either. It bears a house crest I did not recognize until recently, having seen something similar in Varen's own historical records these past weeks." Varen's expression, upon seeing the letter Fenna finally, carefully produced from her modest belongings, shifted immediately into the same sharp, focused intensity Issei had seen from him during the original ledger's discovery years earlier. "This is House Corvain's seal," he said, his voice carrying a grim certainty that settled heavily over the room. "An old house, considerably more established and considerably more careful than House Verith ever was. If they were genuinely involved in funding the original massacre, I would expect them to have covered their tracks with a thoroughness House Veritha's own arrogance never bothered to match." Rias's expression, hearing the name, carried an immediate, sharp recognition that made Issei's stomach tighten with familiar apprehension. "I know House Corvain," she said slowly. "Considerably more powerful than House Vareth ever was, and considerably more careful about maintaining a spotless public reputation. If they are truly complicit in this, proving it is going to require evidence considerably more thorough and undeniable than anything we managed to assemble against Castellan's coalition." Eleanor's expression, absorbing this news, carried the same fierce, unwavering resolve that had carried her through every previous reckoning, tempered now by the hard-won wisdom of exactly how much patient, careful work such a pursuit would inevitably demand. "Then we begin exactly the way we began before," she said. "Patiently, thoroughly, and without giving House Corvain a single reason to suspect we are looking until we have gathered enough truth that looking away is no longer an option available to them." The investigation into House Corvain proved, exactly as Rias had warned, considerably more difficult than anything the household had previously undertaken, the house's careful, generations-deep reputation for propriety making even the most cautious inquiries feel like walking across ground that might collapse without warning at the first misstep. Aquino's network, so effective against House Vareth's comparatively careless trail, found itself repeatedly running into dead ends, old records sealed more thoroughly than seemed proportionate to routine domestic matters, former staff who had simply vanished from all record rather than merely been dismissed, a pattern of careful erasure that Varen, studying each new frustration with grim, professional recognition, found more damning than any single piece of direct evidence could have been. "This is not simply a house with nothing to hide being naturally private," he told the gathered household after weeks of frustrated effort had yielded little beyond a mounting collection of suspicious gaps. "This is the work of people who understood, decades ago, exactly what evidence might eventually surface, and spent considerable resources ensuring it never would. I have encountered exactly this pattern once before, studying the Ashen Order's own methods. Careful, patient erasure, maintained across generations rather than simply reacted to after the fact. It was during this frustrating stretch that Offries, drawing on connections from her own former life that the household had rarely called upon since her arrival, offered a path forward that none of the others had considered. I still have contacts among the fallen who once served various houses in capacities considerably less formal than sworn household staff," she said, during one of the household's increasingly tense strategy discussions. "Mercenaries, information brokers, the kind of quiet service great houses often prefer to keep several careful steps removed from their own official records. If House Corvain required discreet, deniable work in the aftermath of the massacre, work too sensitive for even their own staff to witness directly, there is a reasonable chance someone in those circles might remember something, for the right price or the right persuasion. That's a considerable risk," Rias said carefully. "If House Corvain has spent 15 years this thoroughly covering their tracks, they very likely maintain careful watch over exactly the kind of circles you're describing, precisely to prevent something like this." "I am aware," Offries said. "Which is why I intend to approach it carefully, through channels that owe me genuine loyalty rather than simple transactional discretion. I did not abandon Castellan's service and find my way to genuine belonging in this household merely to watch it walk blindly into a trap I might have helped avoid." The household's discussion that followed carried the same careful, weighing tension of every significant decision the family had faced together, and it was ultimately Eleanor, listening to the full weight of the risk being proposed, who gave voice to the consideration that finally tipped the household's decision. "We have built something this house cannot simply destroy through a single miscalculation," she said. "Not any longer. If Offries's approach draws unwanted attention, we have a settlement, a sister community, a council that has already proven willing to act decisively when presented with genuine evidence. I do not say the risk is small. I say we are considerably better positioned to absorb it than we were facing House Vareth for the very first time, and I trust Offries's judgment in exactly the way this household has taught me to trust everyone who has earned their place within it." Offries's mission, undertaken over the following weeks with careful, patient discretion, ultimately yielded exactly the kind of fragile, dangerous lead the investigation had been searching for: a former information broker, retired from active service and living quietly under an assumed identity, who had once, briefly, handled discreet arrangements on House Corvain's behalf in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, and who, upon careful, respectful approach rather than threat or coercion, proved willing to share what she remembered in exchange for the same kind of protection the household had once extended to Varen. I did not know, at the time, precisely what the arrangements I facilitated were meant to accomplish. The woman, who gave her name only as Ilse, explained carefully once she had been brought before the household under careful, discreet protection. I was hired to manage the discreet relocation and silencing, financially rather than through anything more sinister, of several individuals connected to a matter House Corvain's had at the time described only as a delicate family investment gone regrettably violent. I did not learn the full context until years later, piecing together fragments from other, less careful clients. By then I had already spent the money, and I told myself, as I suspect many people in my position have told themselves across considerably worse circumstances, that ignorance purchased at the time was not the same as complicity discovered afterward. Varen, listening with the same careful, patient focus he brought to every piece of fragile testimony, finally asked the question the entire investigation had been building toward. "Do you have anything beyond memory?" he asked gently. "Any record, any document, anything that might properly corroborate what you are telling us, the way the ledger once corroborated House Veritha's own crimes?" Ilse's expression carried a complicated mixture of fear and relief, the particular weight of someone finally setting down a burden she had carried carefully hidden for 15 years. "I kept records," she admitted. "Discreet ones, coded in a manner only I could properly interpret, insurance against exactly the kind of retaliation someone in my old profession learns to expect eventually. I did not destroy them, though I have moved them several times over the years out of caution. If you are prepared to protect me properly, the way you clearly protected the man who once served the Ashen Order and now sits beside you, I am prepared to retrieve them, and to finally, properly account for whatever small part one played in helping House Corvain bury what they did." The retrieval of Ilse's hidden records proved considerably more fraught than the household's earlier journey to recover the ledger that had once ended House Veritha's standing, House Corvain's careful, generations-deep resources providing them with a watchfulness that Castellan's more desperate, improvised coalition had never quite matched. Ilse herself insisted on guiding the retrieval party personally, understanding better than anyone the elaborate precautions she had once taken to keep her insurance properly hidden, and the small party assembled for the journey, Issei, Eleonor, Kiba, and Afres, whose knowledge of exactly how a house like Corvain typically deployed discreet protection proved invaluable, set out with the same careful, deliberate urgency that had once carried them toward the archive holding House Veritha's ledger. "They will have people watching the more obvious paths," Afres explained as the party made their way through unfamiliar territory toward the modest, unassuming town where Ilse had hidden her records years earlier. "Houses like Corvain do not typically maintain the kind of desperate, improvised forces Castellan eventually resorted to. They maintain quiet, professional watchers, the kind who report rather than engage directly unless genuinely necessary. That is both a comfort and a considerable danger. It means we are less likely to face open combat. It also means, if we are noticed at all, House Corvain will have considerably more time to prepare a proper response before we ever reach the council with what we find." The records themselves, once the party finally reached the modest safety deposit vault where Ilse had hidden them years earlier, proved every bit as damning as her testimony had suggested, coded ledgers detailing the discreet relocation and payment of no fewer than 6 former household staff in the months immediately following the massacre, alongside correspondence, carefully preserved despite Ilse's own professional caution, that referenced the matter in language that left considerably less room for innocent interpretation than House Veritha's own financier had ever bothered to employ. "This is worse than what we found against Verith," Varen said grimly, once the party had returned safely and he had spent several careful hours properly decoding Ilse's meticulous records. Veritha's ledger documented funding, damning but somewhat removed from direct action. This documents House Corvain's own head at the time personally directing the concealment of witnesses to the massacre itself, which suggests direct knowledge and direct involvement considerably beyond simple financial complicity. Rias, reviewing the same records with her own sharp, strategic focus, carried an expression that mixed grim satisfaction with visible unease. "This is enough to bring formally before the council," she said. "More than enough. But I want everyone in this room to understand clearly what we are about to do. House Corvain is not House Verith. Their standing, their alliances, their reach extends considerably further. When this becomes public, and it will become public the moment we bring it before the council, we should expect a response considerably more sophisticated than anything Castellan's desperate, crumbling coalition ever managed." Eleanor's expression, studying the damning records with the same fierce, focused resolve she had carried through every previous reckoning, carried none of the hesitation the warning might reasonably have inspired. "Then we prepare for that response the same way we prepared for everything else," she said. "Carefully, together, and without ever once considering the possibility of simply looking away because the truth proved more dangerous to pursue than we initially hoped." The formal submission of Ilse's records to the council, arranged through the same careful diplomatic channels Rias had used to expose House Verith years earlier, drew a response that confirmed every one of Rias's careful warnings. House Corvain's current head, a woman named Lady Seraphine who had inherited the house's leadership only 3 years after the massacre itself, did not flee or deny the allegations through absent silence the way Castellan initially had. She requested, instead, a formal private audience with Eleanor before any public proceeding began, a request the council, mindful of Corvain's continued standing and influence, felt obligated to grant despite Rias's visible reservations. "I do not trust this," Rias admitted to Eleanor the evening before the audience was scheduled. "A private audience gives her the chance to negotiate, to offer concessions or threats away from any witness who might otherwise report them honestly to the council. I would advise against attending alone." "I do not intend to attend alone," Eleanor said. "But I do intend to hear whatever she has to say directly, Rias. I owed Castellan nothing, and gave him nothing beyond what the council's justice required. But I find myself curious what a woman who inherited this particular crime, rather than commissioned it herself, actually intends to say when finally confronted with it. That distinction may matter considerably more than either of us currently expects." The audience took place 2 days later, in a modest, carefully neutral meeting space arranged through the council's own mediating office rather than either party's home territory, and Issei, accompanying Eleanor alongside Rias despite Lady Seraphine's original request for privacy, found himself studying the woman across the table with careful, guarded assessment as the meeting began. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps only a decade older than Rias herself, and she carried none of Castellan's cold, calculating composure or Malbrandt's oily political charm, only a visible, exhausted weariness that seemed, on first impression, difficult to fully reconcile with the damning records Varen had spent weeks decoding. "I did not order the massacre," Lady Seraphine said, without preamble, once the formal introductions had concluded. "I want that stated plainly before anything else. I was 14 years old when it happened, a minor daughter of House Corvain with no voice in my family's affairs and no knowledge, at the time, of what my father had involved our house in. I inherited leadership only because my father's death 3 years later left no other viable heir, and I inherited, alongside that leadership, records I did not fully understand until I was old enough and secure enough in my own position to properly investigate what he had actually done." Eleanor's expression, listening to this account, carried the same careful, unreadable calculation she had once shown Malbrandt, though something in her posture suggested she was genuinely weighing the account rather than simply waiting for it to conclude before delivering judgment. "You have known the truth, then," she said. "For how long?" "Nearly 10 years, Lady Seraphine admitted, and something in her voice cracked slightly at the confession, the first real fissure in her carefully composed exhaustion. "I have spent those 10 years telling myself I would eventually find the proper way to make it right, and instead spent them quietly, cowardly, continuing my father's careful concealment, terrified of exactly what exposure would cost my house, my staff, the thousands of people whose livelihoods depend on Corvain's continued standing, none of whom bear any personal guilt for what my father did before most of them were even born." "That is not so different from what Varen once told me," Eleanor said carefully. 15 years of silence, told to himself as necessity rather than cowardice. "I am aware of Varen's story," Lady Seraphine said. It is, in fact, partly why I requested this audience rather than simply allowing the council's formal proceedings to unfold without my voice in it. I do not ask you to spare House Corvain the consequences my father's actions have earned. I would not respect myself if I asked for that, and I do not believe you would grant it regardless. I ask only for the chance to be judged for what I have actually done in the years I have held this house's leadership, rather than simply inheriting my father's full weight of guilt without distinction. I have spent a decade quietly redirecting Corvain's resources toward exactly the kind of restoration efforts your own settlement has undertaken, anonymously, because I did not know how else to begin repaying a debt I did not personally create but have nonetheless chosen, every day since discovering it, to carry. The room fell silent at this admission, and Issei watched Eleanor's expression carefully, recognizing the particular weight of a decision considerably more complicated than any she had faced against Castellan's unrepentant, calculating cruelty. "Prove it," Eleanor said finally, her voice steady but no longer carrying the hard, unyielding edge she had shown Castellan throughout his own reckoning. "Whatever anonymous restoration efforts you claim to have funded, whatever genuine remorse you are describing, I will not simply accept it on the strength of a private audience and a well-delivered account. Bring it before the council, publicly, alongside your father's full crimes, and let the truth of both stand fully exposed together, your father's guilt and whatever genuine effort you have made since to answer for it. If what you have told me today is accurate, the council's judgment will reflect that distinction properly. If it is not, you will have earned exactly the same reckoning Castellan received, and I will not shed a single tear over it." Lady Seraphine's expression, hearing this, carried something that looked, unexpectedly, like genuine relief rather than the fear Issei might have anticipated. "That is more grace than I expected, and more accountability than I have allowed myself to properly face in 10 years of careful hiding," she admitted. "I accept those terms completely. I would rather face the full truth publicly, finally, after everything, than spend one more year carrying it quietly and calling that carrying penance." The threat to Lady Seraphine's plan, when it finally surfaced, came not from any external enemy but from within House Corvain itself, a fact that Varen, upon hearing the first reports through Aquino's careful network, noted with grim, unsurprised recognition. Word reached the settlement barely a week after the private audience that a faction within Corvain's own extended family, led by Lady Seraphine's cousin Aldrich, had begun quietly organizing resistance to her intended public confession, viewing the planned exposure not as necessary accountability but as reckless, unnecessary self-destruction that threatened the livelihoods and standing of the entire extended house. "She warned us this might happen," Rias observed, reviewing the reports with careful attention. "A house does not maintain 15 years of careful concealment purely through one guilty conscience's effort. Others clearly knew, or at least suspected, and have simply been more comfortable than Lady Seraphine with continuing the silence indefinitely. The situation escalated considerably faster than any of them anticipated, Aquino's network reporting, only days later, that Aldrich's faction had moved beyond simple internal resistance into something considerably more dangerous, an attempt to have Lady Seraphine formally declared unfit to continue as head of house, citing her intended confession as evidence of instability rather than integrity. A maneuver that, if successful, would strip her of the authority needed to bring her own testimony before the council at all. "He's trying to silence her through Corvain's own internal law," Varen said grimly, studying the details of the challenge Aldrich had formally filed. "If he succeeds, the house's leadership passes to him directly, and I would wager considerable sums that his very first act as head of house would be resuming exactly the kind of careful concealment his uncle originally established." Eleanor's expression, hearing this, carried the same fierce, protective resolve she had shown throughout every previous confrontation with injustice, though this particular fury carried an added complexity, the recognition that Lady Seraphine, whatever guilt she carried for her family's crimes, had become, in this moment, someone whose own courage was actively under attack for the crime of finally choosing honesty. "We cannot simply stand by and watch her silence for trying to do the right thing," she said. "Whatever judgment the council eventually renders against House Corvain, it should be rendered against the truth Lady Seraphine is trying to bring forward, not buried by a cousin more interested in protecting comfortable lies than facing honest consequences." Rias's expression carried careful, strategic consideration. We have no formal standing to intervene in House Corvain's internal succession disputes, she said. That would be considered significant overreach, even by a council increasingly sympathetic to our previous efforts against Vareth and Castellan. But we do have standing to formally request the council expedite its review of the evidence we have already submitted, before Aldrich's internal challenge can fully resolve in his favor. If the council acts on Ilse's records directly, independent of whatever leadership dispute is unfolding within Corvain itself, Aldrich's maneuver becomes considerably less useful to him regardless of its outcome. The household's response, coordinated swiftly through Rias's careful diplomatic channels, brought the council's formal review forward by nearly 3 weeks, and it was during this compressed, urgent timeline that Lady Seraphine herself, facing her cousin's internal challenge with a courage that surprised even Eleanor's careful, guarded assessment, made the decision to preempt Aldrich's maneuver entirely. Appearing before her own house's assembled council to formally, publicly confess her father's crimes before Aldrich's challenge could even be properly heard. I will not be silenced by a cousin more concerned with our family's comfort than its conscience, she told her own assembled house. According to the account that reached the settlement within days, delivered with a steadiness that considerably strengthened her position rather than the instability Aldrich had hoped to portray. Whatever this confession costs House Corvain, and I expect it will cost us a great deal, I would rather face that cost honestly than continue building our family's future on my father's buried crimes. The reports that followed suggested Lady Seraphine's preemptive confession had shifted the internal balance of House Corvain considerably in her favor. A significant portion of the extended family, horrified upon finally learning the full truth Aldrich had apparently long suspected and helped conceal, rallying behind her rather than her cousin's continued denial, and it was Varen, reviewing the rapidly shifting reports with visible satisfaction, who finally offered the household's assessment of exactly what this internal upheaval meant for the coming council proceeding. She has done something considerably braver than simply confessing to us in a private audience, he said. She has confessed to her own people first, publicly, at genuine personal and political risk, before the council ever formally required it of her. Whatever judgment the council ultimately renders, I do not believe we are dealing with someone attempting to manage her exposure for strategic advantage any longer. I believe we are watching someone genuinely choosing the harder, more honest path, exactly the way Varen himself once did at our own gate. Aldrich's response to his cousin's preemptive confession arrived with a desperation that confirmed every suspicion Varen had harbored about exactly how much he had known and helped conceal, a final, reckless attempt to prevent the council's formal proceeding from ever properly examining Ilse's records at all. Word reached the settlement late one evening, carried urgently through Aquino's network, that a small, discreet group of agents, clearly acting on Aldrich's private authority rather than any sanctioned house action, had been tracked moving toward the modest town where Ilse continued to live under the household's careful protection. He means to silence the one witness whose testimony he cannot control through internal house politics, Offrey said grimly, studying the report with the same professional focus she had once brought to assessing threats on Castellan's behalf. Lady Seraphine's confession damages him considerably, but Ilse's records remain the actual, undeniable evidence. If he can eliminate her before the council formally hears her testimony, he may still believe he can control the narrative that follows, framing his uncle's crimes as unproven rumor rather than documented fact. We're not letting that happen, Issei said immediately, already moving toward the door with the same protective urgency that had first carried him into a forest clearing many years earlier. Ilse trusted us to keep her safe when she agreed to testify. That's not a promise we get to break just because it's become inconvenient for someone else. The party that departed within the hour, Issei, Eleonor, Kiba, and Offrey's once again, carried an urgency that echoed their earlier retrieval mission for House Varetha's ledger, though this time the stakes carried a weight considerably more personal. A woman who had risked everything to finally, honestly account for a burden she had carried unfairly for 15 years. Now facing exactly the kind of violent silencing her own testimony had helped expose in others. They reached the town just past midnight, and it was Offrey's careful, practiced instincts that first identified the discreet positioning of Aldrich's agents around the modest home where Ilse had been staying, a coordinated, professional approach that confirmed exactly the kind of resources Aldrich had clearly been willing to commit to preventing his own exposure. 3 positioned outside, watching for exactly the kind of protection we're currently providing, Offreys reported quietly, having scouted the perimeter with careful, silent precision. At least 2 more likely inside already, given how long they've apparently been in position. This is not an improvised strike. This is careful, professional work, the kind Aldrich's resources would naturally provide. Then we handle it the same careful way, Kiba said, and the party moved into position with the same practiced coordination that 2 years of shared, difficult trials had built between them, Offreys and Kiba handling the outer perimeter with quiet, efficient precision, while Issei and Eleanor moved directly toward the house itself. Understanding that whatever agents had already gained entry represented the most immediate danger to Ilsa's safety, they found her in the home's modest kitchen, held at blade point by a single agent who had clearly been in the process of extracting information about her hidden records before finishing his actual task, and Issei's boosted gear flared crimson the moment he took in the scene, closing the distance before the agent could fully register the sudden interruption. Boost, he called, and the resulting strike ended the confrontation with a speed that left the agent crumpled against the kitchen wall before Ilsa had even fully processed her rescue, her face pale with shock but otherwise unharmed. "You came," she said, her voice carrying disbelieving relief as Eleanor helped her steady herself. "I did not truly believe, when you offered protection, that it would actually extend this far. I have spent too many years trusting people who eventually decided my safety mattered less than their own convenience." "We don't work that way," Issei said simply, echoing the same plain, unconditional promise he had made to every previous survivor who had ever doubted the household's genuine commitment. "You're safe. That doesn't change just because keeping that promise got harder than we expected." The remaining agents outside, faced with Kiba and Offreys' swift, coordinated response, broke and fled rather than pressing an engagement that had clearly turned decisively against Aldrich's careful planning, and by the time the party finally made their way back toward the settlement with Ilsa safely in tow, word of Aldrich's failed desperate gambit had already begun reaching the wider council through channels considerably less sympathetic to his continued position than he had likely anticipated. "He has just handed the council undeniable proof of exactly the kind of desperate criminality his uncle's original crimes represented," Varen observed grimly, once the party had returned and the full account of the failed attack had been properly documented. "Whatever sympathy his internal challenge against Lady Seraphine might have retained, I suspect it has entirely evaporated now that he has attempted violence against a formally protected witness rather than simply losing an honest political dispute." The formal council proceeding, when it finally convened barely a week after Aldrich's failed attempt on Ilsa's life, drew a gathering considerably larger than even the household's original confrontation with House Vareth had managed, word of the unfolding scandal having spread through every corner of the underworld's political circles with the particular speed reserved for stories that combined old crimes, family betrayal, and genuine, dramatic redemption in equal measure. Eleanor stood once again before the assembled representatives, though this time she did not stand alone in her accusation, Lady Seraphine herself present at the gathering, having formally requested the right to speak alongside rather than simply await the council's judgment from a distance. "I do not ask this council for leniency on my father's behalf," Lady Seraphine said, once Ilsa's testimony and the full weight of her carefully preserved records had been formally entered into the proceeding. "His crimes are documented beyond reasonable dispute, and I would consider it a further betrayal of everything I have spent 10 years trying to make right if this council extended him, even posthumously, any mercy his actions never earned. What I ask, and I ask it knowing full well the council may reasonably refuse, is that House Corvain's continued standing be judged on the totality of what has actually happened here, my father's crime, my own decade of concealment followed by voluntary, costly confession, my cousin's attempted violence against a witness this council itself now protects, and the restoration efforts I have quietly funded these past 10 years, seeking no credit for them until this exact moment forced my hand." The presiding elder, the same silver-haired devil who had first heard Eleanor's original accusation against House Vareth years earlier, listened to this account with the same slow, weighted patience Issei remembered from that first confrontation, and when he finally spoke, His voice carried a gravity that settled the entire hall into careful, attentive silence. "This council has judged crimes of this nature only twice before in recent memory," he said. Once against House Verith, whose leadership offered no accounting whatsoever for its actions beyond calculated denial until the evidence against them became undeniable. We judge House Corvain today under considerably different circumstances, a house whose current leadership discovered inherited guilt and chose, eventually if not immediately, to answer for it honestly, at genuine personal cost, even as another member of that same house attempted violence to prevent exactly that honesty from reaching this hall. Eleanor, standing at the center of the proceeding with the same fierce, unwavering presence she had carried into every previous confrontation, finally spoke into the elder's careful deliberation, her voice carrying none of the harder edge she had shown Castellan, though it lost none of its underlying resolve. "I would ask this council to consider something I have learned across these past several years of seeking justice for my people," she said. "Accountability and destruction are not the same thing. House Verith chose denial until the very end, and earned, I believe, exactly the destruction that followed. Lady Seraphine has chosen something considerably harder, publicly confessing a crime she did not commit but nonetheless inherited, at genuine risk to everything her family has built across generations. I do not ask this council to forgive her father. I ask only that whatever judgment falls on House Corvain distinguish properly between the crime and the courage it eventually took to expose it, exactly the distinction my own people were denied for 15 years while the world looked away from what was done to us." The council's deliberation, following this testimony, stretched across the remainder of the day, and when the presiding elder finally returned with a formal judgment, it carried a nuance the household's earlier confrontation with House Verith had never required. House Corvain's founding crimes formally, publicly condemned and permanently entered into the council's record. Significant reparations ordered toward the Duskwood restoration effort, and the broader compensation of every family affected by the original massacre, but the house's continued standing preserved under Lady Seraphine's leadership, specifically, a judgment that stripped Aldrich of any remaining claim to succession entirely while allowing his cousin's decade of quiet penance and costly public honesty to stand as genuine mitigation rather than convenient excuse. "It is not the reckoning House Verith faced," the elder said, addressing the gathered hall directly. "It is not meant to be. This council has learned, across recent years, that justice properly served must account for more than simple guilt or innocence. It must account for what people do, honestly and at genuine cost, once that guilt finally comes to light. Lady Seraphine has earned, through considerable personal risk, a chance to lead her house toward genuine repair rather than simple punishment. I trust this council, and the Duskwood Restoration whose testimony made this judgment possible, to hold her to that chance as fiercely as justice itself requires." Eleanor's expression, hearing the judgment finally rendered, carried a complicated mixture of hard-won satisfaction and something gentler, the particular relief of watching justice serve its proper purpose without simply becoming vengeance dressed in more formal language. And when Lady Seraphine approached her afterward, the two women's exchange carried none of the wary calculation that had marked their first private audience weeks earlier, only the quiet, genuine respect of two people who had, each, in their own difficult way, chosen the harder path toward honesty. "Thank you," Lady Seraphine said simply. "Not for mercy, because I do not believe what you offered today was simple mercy. For insisting the council see the whole truth, rather than merely the easiest version of it. That is all I have ever truly wanted from anyone," Eleanor said. "The whole truth, however complicated it eventually proves to be." Fenna's presence at the council proceeding, quiet and largely unremarked upon by the wider gathering, carried a personal significance that Issei understood only fully once the crowd had dispersed and the small household party made their way back toward their lodgings for the evening, her expression carrying the particular, complicated weight of someone who had just watched her grandmother's 15 years of hidden fear finally properly resolved before witnesses who mattered. "She spent her whole life afraid of a name she never even fully knew," Fenna said quietly, watching the last of the dispersing crowd from the edge of the council grounds. "Corvain. She carried that fear all the way into her final years, still refusing to speak it aloud even when I begged her, near the end, to tell me what she was so frightened of. I wish she could have lived to see this. Not simply the judgment itself, though I think she would have found some peace in it. The fact that speaking the name finally, honestly, changed something instead of simply inviting the retaliation she always feared. Eleanor, standing beside her with the same gentle, protective warmth she had shown every survivor who had ever carried grief this personal, took Fenna's hand in her own. She carried you safely through everything she feared, Eleanor said. That is its own kind of victory, Fenna, whether or not she lived to see today's judgment. You stand here now, whole, safe, and finally free of a fear that was never truly yours to carry in the first place. I believe that is exactly the peace she was working toward. Every quiet year she kept you protected without ever fully explaining why. Fenna's answering smile, though touched with grief, carried genuine warmth, and in the weeks that followed, her integration into the settlement deepened considerably, no longer simply another careful new arrival finding her footing among strangers, but someone who had helped uncover and finally close one of the last remaining threads of her people's 15-year-old tragedy. Thessaly's training sessions grew steadily more advanced under her dedicated effort, and it was Sable, working with her patiently through the same careful exercises that had once helped Eleanor learn to consciously access the bloodline gift, who finally reported, with quiet, delighted satisfaction, that Fenna's own connection to the ancient magic had begun to answer with a strength that suggested her scattered, isolated upbringing had done nothing to diminish the depth of her inherited bond. The settlement itself, meanwhile, continued its steady, patient growth through the aftermath of House Corvain's formal reckoning, Lady Seraphine's promised reparations arriving with a thoroughness that considerably accelerated several of Sable's ongoing agricultural and architectural projects, and it was during one of the settlement's regular council meetings, held to review exactly how these new resources might best be allocated, that Rias raised the development that had been quietly building throughout the preceding months without anyone fully appreciating its scale until laid out plainly before the assembled leadership. Word of everything we have accomplished these past years, House Vareth, Castellan, the Hollows reunion, and now House Corvain's reckoning, has traveled considerably further than I believe any of us properly anticipated, she said. We are no longer simply a household with a garden, nor even a settlement with a sister community across the mountains. We have become, in the eyes of a great many houses across the underworld, a genuine political force, one capable of bringing even established houses to proper account for crimes long buried. That reputation carries real value. It also carries real risk, attracting attention from parties who may wish to align themselves with that influence for reasons considerably less noble than genuine justice. Eleanor considered this with the same careful, deliberate weight she brought to every significant strategic question, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular blend of hard-won wisdom and cautious hope that had guided the household through every previous transition. Then we continue exactly as we have always continued, she said. Patiently, honestly, and refusing to let influence become an end in itself rather than simply a natural consequence of choosing, again and again, to do the difficult, honest thing rather than the easy, comfortable one. If houses wish to align with us because we have proven trustworthy, let them prove themselves worthy of that alliance in return, the same patient way every survivor who ever found their way to our garden had to prove themselves worthy of the family that welcomed them. Rias's answering nod carried genuine agreement, though her expression retained the careful, watchful quality of someone already turning her attention toward whatever challenges this growing influence might eventually invite, and Issei, listening to the discussion unfold around him, found himself reflecting, not for the first time, on exactly how far the shape of their lives had traveled since a single desperate night in a forest clearing, and exactly how much further it seemed, with each passing season, still determined to go. The season that followed House Corvain's formal reckoning carried the settlement through its most abundant stretch of growth since its founding, Lady Seraphine's reparations funding not only the immediate agricultural and architectural projects Sable had proposed but an ambitious expansion of the settlement's formal school. Thessaly and Varen working together to design a proper curriculum that balanced the old Duskwood traditions with the practical education every child, regardless of heritage, would need to navigate the wider world the settlement now found itself increasingly woven into. Corin, now old enough to toddle determinately after Ren whenever she visited the training yard, had become something of an unofficial mascot for the settlement's youngest generation, and it was watching him one warm afternoon, gleefully attempting to mimic Thessaly's careful forms with movements considerably more enthusiastic than precise, that Eleanor found herself struck by a realization she shared quietly with Issei that evening. "He will grow up never needing to learn any of this the hard way," she said, watching their son sleep peacefully in his small bed. "Every lesson Thessaly teaches him will be exactly that, a lesson, not survival. I do not think I have properly understood, until watching him today, exactly how completely that changes what it means to raise a Duskwood child now, compared to what it meant even 5 years ago. That's the whole point though, right?" Issei said gently. "Not just protecting people. Changing what protection even needs to mean, so the next generation doesn't have to carry what your generation did." Eleanor's answering smile carried the same quiet, settled peace that had become increasingly present in her over the preceding years, though it was interrupted, that same evening, by the arrival of a messenger from the Hollow, carrying news that, while considerably less dramatic than House Corvain's reckoning, nonetheless marked another significant milestone in the steady, patient work of reunion the two communities had undertaken together. "Marin wishes you to know the Hollow's Council has voted, after considerable deliberation, to formally open the mountain paths to any Duskwood survivor who wishes passage, regardless of which settlement they ultimately choose to call home," the messenger reported. "She says to tell you, specifically, that she considers this decision the final proper conclusion of everything your original visit began, two peoples no longer separated by mountains or fear, but genuinely, permanently connected regardless of where each family ultimately chooses to settle." Eleanor's eyes carried bright, immediate tears at this news, and she embraced the messenger with the same warm, unguarded gratitude she had shown Marin herself at their very first meeting. "Tell her thank you," she said. "Tell her I do not believe either of our communities could have asked for a more fitting conclusion to everything we set out to build together." The formal opening of the mountain paths, celebrated jointly by both communities in a festival that drew comparisons, among the settlement's older residents, to the original spring celebration marking the sister settlement agreement years earlier, marked what Varin, in his careful, ongoing historical documentation, would eventually describe as the true completion of the Duskwood Restoration's founding chapter. An entire scattered people, fractured by 15 years of grief and hiding, finally, fully reunited into something whole enough to properly call itself a nation rather than merely a collection of survivors. "It is finished," Eleanor told Issei quietly, standing together at the edge of the settlement's central square during the festival's joyful height, watching families from both communities mingle freely beneath lanterns strung between buildings that had not existed 5 years earlier. "Not the danger, I think, not entirely, and not the work of continuing to grow and protect what we have built. But the restoration itself, the actual promise I made to myself in that ritual circle so many years ago, to find whatever remained of my people and help them build something worth surviving for. That promise, I believe, is finally, completely fulfilled." Issei pulled her close, watching the joyful celebration unfold around them, Corin asleep against his shoulder, the whole hard-won, ever-growing family gathered together in the warm evening light. "Then let's just be here for it," he said softly. "No new threat to prepare for tonight. No council reckoning waiting on the horizon. Just this. Just everyone we love, safe, together, and finally, completely home." Eleanor's answering smile carried the full, settled weight of 5 years of patient, difficult, ultimately triumphant building, and for one long, perfect evening, the whole shape of the future felt, for the very first time since a chained, exhausted stranger had looked up at a devil stepping into a ruined ritual circle, entirely, peacefully unhurried. The quiet months that followed the mountain path's formal opening brought a texture to settlement life that none of the household had experienced before, not the tense vigilance of active danger, nor even the focused urgency of pursuing justice against the hidden enemy, but something closer to simple, sustained ordinary living. The particular rhythm of a community no longer defined primarily by what it survived or what it fought for, but by what it had actually, finally become. Ilsa, having found a genuine, permanent home within the settlement after her testimony against House Corvain, gradually settled into a role that surprised everyone including herself, teaching a small class of older settlement residents the careful, patient skills of discrete information gathering and verification. Knowledge she had once used in service of considerably less noble purposes now repurposed toward helping the settlement's own council make properly informed decisions about the many new political relationships their growing influence continued to invite. I never expected this particular use for my old skills, she admitted to Varen one afternoon, watching her small class practice the careful cross-referencing techniques she had spent a lifetime perfecting. I spent decades learning to uncover secrets for whoever paid best. It is strange, and rather wonderful, to finally use that same knowledge simply to help good people make wiser choices. Varen's answering smile carried the particular warmth of someone who understood, better than most in the settlement, exactly how meaningful that kind of redemption could feel after years of carrying guilt for choices made under considerably harder circumstances. It is, I think, the truest gift this settlement offers anyone who finds their way here, he said. Not simply safety, though that matters enormously. The chance to become someone new, built from whatever skills and scars the world gave you, rather than remaining forever defined by the worse uses those skills were once put toward. Fenna, meanwhile, had grown steadily into one of the settlement's most capable young fighters under Thessaly and Offries's combined tutelage, her natural talent for the bloodline gifts deeper magic drawing increasing attention from Sable, who had begun, with careful excitement, to suggest that Fenna's particular connection to the ancient power might eventually rival even Eleanor's own considerable command of it. It was during one such training session, watching Fenna successfully draw a controlled response from the garden's roots for the first time without any direct guidance, that Eleanor found herself struck by the particular, quiet satisfaction of watching her people's restoration continue expanding beyond simply her own direct efforts. She does not need me standing over her shoulder for every lesson any longer, Eleanor observed to Issei that evening, watching Fenna practice alone in the fading evening light with visible, growing confidence. I confess I did not expect that particular feeling, watching someone I helped guide finally surpass needing my guidance at all. It is considerably more satisfying than I anticipated. That's what raising anything well is supposed to feel like, eventually Issei said. Kids, students, whole settlements. You build it carefully enough that it doesn't need you standing over it forever. That's not losing anything. That's the whole thing actually working. The settlement's continued growth, meanwhile, drew increasing formal attention from the wider council, several houses now formally seeking diplomatic ties with what had become, in the span of 5 remarkable years, one of the most respected and increasingly influential communities operating under the council's broader authority. Rias, managing this growing web of formal relationships with the same careful, strategic patience she had shown throughout every previous challenge, found herself, more and more, serving as much as a diplomat between the settlement and the wider underworld as she did the household's original protector, a role she embraced with visible satisfaction even as it carried its own new complications. We are becoming something considerably larger than any of us originally set out to build, she observed during one particularly involved council meeting, reviewing the settlement's growing list of formal diplomatic requests with careful attention. I do not say that with any regret. I say it because I believe we should all remain mindful of exactly how much responsibility that growth continues to place on every choice we make going forward. We are no longer simply protecting a garden, or even a settlement. We are, increasingly, a model other communities are beginning to look toward, for better and occasionally, I suspect, for worse. Eleanor, listening with the same thoughtful attention she brought to every significant discussion, finally offered the same steady philosophy that had guided every previous season of the settlement's remarkable growth. Then we remain exactly what we have always tried to be, she said. Patient, honest, and willing to do the harder right thing rather than the easier convenient one. If that continues to draw the wider world's attention, let it. I would rather be watched for the right reasons than hidden for fear of the wrong ones, and I believe, after everything we have built together, that is a lesson this entire settlement has thoroughly earned the right to trust. It was on a quiet autumn morning, nearly a year after House Corvain's formal reckoning, that Rias called the household's core family together with an urgency that immediately set Issei's old, familiar instincts on alert, though her expression, when they gathered in the settlement's council hall, carried curiosity considerably more than the grim tension such summons had once reliably signaled. I received a formal request overnight, Unlike anything the Council's channels have carried to us before, she said, spreading a sealed letter across the table with visible, careful interest. It comes not from a house seeking judgment or alliance, but from the Council itself, directly, requesting our presence at a gathering considerably larger and more significant than any single territorial dispute or inquest we have previously been drawn into. What kind of gathering? Eleanor asked, and Issei could hear the careful wariness beneath her curiosity. 5 years of hard experience having taught her that significant council attention rarely arrived without some measure of complication attached. A convening of every recognized bloodline and territorial power across the region, Rias said, reading carefully from the letter's formal, dense language. Called specifically to address what the Council describes only as a matter of considerable and growing concern regarding the stability of ley currents across several territories, including, the letter specifically notes, territories bordering both our settlement and the Hollow. They are requesting Duskwood representation directly, given our bloodline's unique historical relationship with exactly this kind of ley stability. Varen, listening with the same sharp, historical focus he brought to every significant development, leaned forward with visible interest. That is considerably vaguer language than the Council typically employs for a formal convening, he observed. Ley instability serious enough to require every recognized power's attention, and yet no specific incident named. That suggests either genuine uncertainty about the cause, or a council being deliberately cautious about causing panic before they properly understand what they are actually facing. Eleanor's expression, absorbing this information, carried the particular, familiar weight of someone recognizing that whatever hard-won peace the settlement currently enjoyed was very likely, once again, approaching some manner of significant transition. The bloodline gift stabilizes ley currents, she said slowly. If something considerably larger than our own restoration is now destabilizing them across multiple territories, that is not simply a matter the Council is inviting us to observe. That is a matter where our people's particular knowledge may prove genuinely essential to understanding, and perhaps resolving, whatever is actually happening. Rias nodded, her expression carrying the same careful, strategic calculation she brought to every significant new development. That is precisely why I believe we should attend, and attend prepared, she said. Whatever this gathering ultimately reveals, I do not believe it is coincidental that the Council has specifically requested Duskwood representation now, 5 years after our restoration first demonstrated exactly how significant that bloodline gift can become when properly cultivated. The household's preparations for the journey began within days, and it was Issei, watching Eleanor pack with the same careful, deliberate focus she had shown before every previous significant journey, who finally voiced the question that had been quietly settling into his own chest since Rias's original announcement. You don't sound worried, he observed. Not the way you sounded before Castellan's final assault, or even before we first set out for the Hollow. This one feels different somehow. It is different, Eleanor agreed, folding a traveling cloak with practiced efficiency. Every previous challenge we have faced arrived from malice, from someone's deliberate cruelty or greed. This arrives, if Varen's instincts are correct, from something considerably larger and less personal, forces of nature or magic that no single villain's defeat will simply resolve. I confess I do not yet know whether that should worry me more or less than everything we have already survived together. I only know that whatever we find at this gathering, we will meet it the same way we have met everything else these past 5 years, patiently, honestly, and together. Together, Issei agreed, and as the household's small party finally set out toward the Council's distant gathering grounds, the settlement's lamplit windows glowing steady and warm behind them in the gathering evening dark, he found himself carrying the same quiet, settled confidence that had carried him through every previous chapter of their remarkable, hard-won story. Whatever challenge awaited them this time, they would face it exactly as they always had, one deliberate, stubborn, hopeful choice at a time. Before their departure, Eleanor made one final stop, alone, at the base of the persimmon tree where the whole improbable shape of their story had first begun to grow, kneeling in the cool morning grass with her palm pressed flat against the roots that had, over 5 remarkable years, answered every desperate call she had ever asked of them. Issei found her there, watching quietly from a respectful distance until she finally looked up and beckoned him closer. I wanted to ask it something, she admitted, a faint, self-conscious smile touching her expression at the admission. Foolish, perhaps. Sable would tell me the gift does not truly listen in any way that resembles conversation. But I have learned, across these past years, that some things are worth doing even when they defy tidy explanation. What did you ask? Issei said, settling beside her in the grass. Whether it believes we are ready for whatever comes next, she said. I do not know if it answered. But I find, sitting here now, that I already know my own answer regardless. We are ready, Issei. Not because we have nothing left to fear, but because we have built something strong enough to carry that fear together rather than letting it carry us the way it once did. Issei took her hand, watching the morning light filter warm through the tree's wide, familiar canopy, the same canopy that had once sheltered a wedding, a settlement's founding, a homecoming reunion 5 years in the making. Whatever this lay instability turns out to be, he said, we've got a whole settlement behind us now. A sister community across the mountains. A council that actually listens. People like Varen and Offries and Ilsa who turned their whole lives around because this place gave them somewhere real to land. That's not nothing, going into whatever's next. It is considerably more than nothing, Eleanor agreed, rising to her feet and offering him her hand in turn. It is, I think, everything a scared, chained stranger in a forest clearing could ever have hoped for, multiplied 100 times over by every person who chose to help build it alongside her. They found Rias, Kiba, and Varen already waiting at the settlement's gate when they arrived, the small party's travel gear packed and ready, and Corin, held in Asia's careful arms for one final embrace before their departure, reached out with delighted, babbling enthusiasm toward his mother, entirely unaware of the significance behind the journey his parents were about to undertake, and entirely blissfully secure in the simple certainty that they would return to him, exactly as they always had, exactly as they always would. Take care of him, Eleanor told Asia softly, pressing a gentle kiss to her son's forehead. Always, Asia said, the same warm, steady promise the household had extended to every member of its hard-won family since the very beginning. The party set out shortly after, the settlement's timber homes and lamplit streets receding steadily behind them as the road wound toward whatever the council's distant gathering grounds ultimately held in store, and Issei, walking beside Eleanor with the same steady, determined resolve that had carried him through every significant chapter of their remarkable life together, felt the particular, settled certainty that had come to define everything they had built since that very first desperate night that whatever waited at the end of this new road, they would meet it exactly as they always had, patient, honest, and entirely, unshakably together. The journey toward the council's distant gathering grounds carried the party through territory none of them had previously traveled, the landscape shifting gradually from the familiar hills surrounding their settlement into considerably wilder country, and it was on the second evening, making camp beside a quiet stream, that Varen shared something of the deeper historical context behind the council's unusual summons. Information he had spent the preceding days carefully gathering from his own extensive network of contacts. The old stories describe something called the deep current, he explained, spreading a hand-drawn diagram of the region's major ley lines across a flat stone beside their small fire. A kind of foundational magical structure beneath the more visible currents that bloodlines like the dusk would typically stabilize. It is rarely discussed even among scholars, considered by most to be more legend than genuine geological fact. But if the Council's concern truly involves ley instability spanning multiple territories simultaneously, rather than a single localized disturbance, that suggests something disrupting the deep current itself, rather than merely one region's surface magic. What would cause something like that? Eleanor asked, watching the diagram with careful, focused attention. I do not know with certainty, Varen admitted. The old text suggests such disruptions have occurred perhaps 3 times in recorded history, each associated with some manner of significant magical catastrophe, a war fought with weapons that tore at the fabric of the region's magic itself, or, in one considerably older account, the deliberate, reckless summoning of something that should have remained undisturbed. I confess I do not know which possibility, if any, applies to whatever the Council is currently investigating. Rias, listening with the same sharp strategic focus she brought to every serious development, considered this information carefully. Then we should prepare for the possibility that this gathering involves something considerably beyond another house's hidden crimes, she said. Not a matter of accountability this time, perhaps, but a matter of genuine, shared danger that no single villain's defeat will resolve. Eleanor's expression, absorbing this sobering possibility, carried the same steady, hard-won resolve that had carried her through every previous challenge, though Issei could see, beneath that resolve, the particular weight of someone recognizing that whatever waited ahead might ask something considerably different of her than anything she had yet faced. If the deep current is genuinely destabilizing, she said slowly, then the bloodline gift's role in this matter may extend considerably beyond simply lending our testimony to the Council's deliberations. If our people's magic is meant to stabilize ley currents at the surface level, there may be some connection, some responsibility, that reaches toward whatever is happening at the deeper level as well. That is a considerable weight to place on your shoulders based on old texts and careful speculation alone, Issei said gently, watching her expression with quiet concern. I am aware, Eleanor said. But I have learned, across these past 5 years, that speculation eventually proves either unfounded or prophetic, and either way, worrying over which outcome awaits us accomplishes considerably less than simply preparing as thoroughly as we are able and meeting whatever we actually find with clear eyes rather than anxious assumption. The remainder of the journey passed with a quieter, more contemplative atmosphere than any of their previous travels together, each member of the small party turning over Varen's careful historical account in their own private thoughts, and it was only as the Council's distant gathering grounds finally came into view on the horizon, considerably more grand and formally arranged than the neutral estate where Eleanor had once first confronted House Varetha's crimes, that the party's collective attention sharpened fully back toward the immediate, practical challenge of whatever formal proceeding awaited them, 5 years of hard-won experience having taught every one of them exactly how much careful, clear-headed presence such gatherings ultimately demanded. Whatever this turns out to be, Eleanor said quietly, taking Issei's hand as they approached the gathering ground's formal entrance, we walk into it the same way we have walked into everything else. Together, and unwilling to let fear decide our answer before we have even properly heard the question. Together, Issei agreed, and the party made their way forward into the gathering crowd, the weight of an uncertain new chapter settling over them with the same familiar, steady resolve that had carried this remarkable, hard-won family through everything that had come before. The gathering grounds, once the party finally passed through their formal entrance, proved considerably more vast and more crowded than anything Issei had previously witnessed at any council proceeding, representatives from bloodlines and territorial powers he did not recognize mingling in careful, watchful clusters across a sprawling stone amphitheater built, according to Varen's quiet, fascinated observation, long before even the oldest devil houses had risen to their current prominence. I have read of this place, he murmured, taking in the ancient architecture with visible awe. The Assembly of Currents. It is said to convene only when a matter genuinely threatens the stability of the region's shared magic, rather than any single house's private interest. I did not expect, in my lifetime, to actually witness it called. Eleanor, walking beside Issei with the same careful, composed presence she brought to every significant gathering, studied the assembled crowd with visible curiosity. I recognize almost none of these bloodlines, she admitted quietly. Powers considerably older than the Council's usual business, I think, drawn from territories our own dealings have never previously touched. The presiding figure who eventually called the assembly to formal order was not the same silver-haired elder who had overseen Eleanor's previous confrontations with House Vareth and House Corvain, but an ancient, imposing woman introduced only as Warden Kasha, whose title, Varen explained under his breath, belonged to an office considerably older and more specialized than the regional council's usual leadership, tasked specifically with monitoring the deep magical structures underlying the region's more visible territorial powers. 3 months ago, Warden Kasha began, her voice carrying across the amphitheater with an authority that settled the vast, murmuring crowd into immediate, attentive silence. My order detected the first measurable disturbance in what the old texts call the deep current, the foundational structure beneath every territorial ley line every bloodline and house in this gathering depends upon. Whether or not you have ever properly understood that dependency. We believed, initially, this disturbance localized and temporary. It has not proven either. It has spread, steadily, across no fewer than 11 territories in these 3 months alone, and our Order's most careful study suggests it will continue spreading, with accelerating speed, unless its source is properly identified and addressed. A ripple of anxious murmurs moved through the crowd, and Warden Kasha allowed it to settle before continuing, her expression carrying the particular grim patience of someone who had clearly delivered difficult news many times before in her long service. We have identified the disturbance's likely point of origin, she continued. A sealed site, ancient even by this Order's considerable standards, located at the convergence of several major ley lines in territory currently unclaimed by any recognized house. Our Order's own investigators have twice attempted to properly examine the site directly. Both attempts ended in failure, our investigators withdrawing with injuries our healers still do not fully understand, and readings that suggest whatever seal originally contained this site's danger has begun, gradually and dangerously, to weaken. Rias, listening with the same sharp strategic focus she brought to every serious threat, finally spoke into the tense silence that followed, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered assembly. What was originally sealed there? She asked, and the directness of the question drew visible approval from several nearby representatives who had clearly been wondering the same thing without daring to ask it themselves. Warden Kasha's expression, considering the question, carried a weight that made even Issei's instincts sharpen with wary attention. The old texts are frustratingly incomplete on this point, she admitted. What survives suggests the site once contained something referred to only as the Hollow King, a title that predates even the oldest bloodlines gathered in this assembly today, associated in every surviving fragment with the Deep Current's original formation. Whether this Hollow King represents a being, a force, or something considerably harder to properly categorize, our Order's records simply do not preserve enough detail to say with confidence. Eleanor's hand found Issei's without either of them quite deciding to reach for the other first, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same careful, deliberate weight she brought to every significant revelation. You have called this assembly to request our aid in properly investigating and resealing this site, she said. It was not a question. We have, Warden Kasha confirmed. And we have specifically requested the Duskwood Restoration's presence because our Order's oldest records suggest the Deep Current's original stabilization, whatever ritual or bloodline gift first accomplished it, bears a resemblance to your own people's particular magic considerably closer than mere coincidence would explain. The revelation settled over the gathered assembly with a weight that Issei felt as much as heard, murmurs rippling through the crowd as representatives from a dozen unfamiliar bloodlines turned their attention toward Eleanor with expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to something that looked, in a few cases, uncomfortably close to calculation. Eleanor herself absorbed the revelation with the same careful, composed focus she had shown throughout every previous confrontation, though Issei, standing close enough to feel the subtle tension in her posture, recognized the particular quality of her stillness as something closer to genuine shock carefully contained. I do not understand how that could be possible, she said finally, addressing Warden Kasha directly. My people's bloodline gift stabilizes territorial ley currents at a considerably smaller, more localized scale than anything you are describing. We have never claimed, nor to my knowledge ever possessed, any connection to whatever foundational structure you are calling the Deep Current. Warden Kasha's expression carried the particular patience of someone accustomed to delivering information that upended long-held understanding. Our Order does not claim you possess conscious knowledge of this connection, she said. Only that the resemblance in the old records is close enough to warrant serious investigation. It is entirely possible your bloodline's gift represents a smaller, more specialized descendant of whatever original power once maintained the Deep Current directly, diminished across countless generations the same way many ancient bloodline gifts have diminished from their original scope. It is also possible the resemblance is coincidental, two related but ultimately distinct forms of the same broader category of magic. We do not yet know. That is, in significant part, why we have called you here. Varen, listening with the same sharp historical focus he brought to every significant revelation, finally spoke into the tense silence that followed, his voice carrying the particular careful excitement of a scholar confronting a genuinely unprecedented puzzle. This would explain a great deal that has never previously made proper sense, he said slowly. The scale of devastation the original massacre's coalition was willing to commit, 15 years ago, simply to control or eliminate a single scattered bloodline. If House Verith and its allies believed, even partially, that the Duskwood gift represented something considerably more significant than simple territorial stabilization, that would explain an investment of resources and cruelty that always struck me, even after everything I helped document, as somewhat disproportionate to the stated goal. Eleanor's expression, hearing this, carried a complicated mixture of dawning, uneasy recognition and old, familiar anger. "You are suggesting my people were not simply valuable," she said slowly. "You are suggesting we were feared, for reasons considerably deeper than anyone ever properly explained to us, even after everything the Council's inquests uncovered about Verith and Corvain both. It is a possibility that deserves serious investigation," Warden Cassius said carefully. "I do not say this to frighten you, Eleanor of the Duskwood line. I say it because I believe you deserve the full truth of what we are asking you to investigate, rather than a comfortable simplification. If your bloodline does carry some genuine, deeper connection to the Deep Current's original stabilization, your presence at the sealed site may prove not merely helpful but essential to properly understanding, and hopefully resolving, whatever danger is currently spreading." The Assembly's subsequent deliberation, spanning the remainder of that first day and well into the evening, ultimately settled on a plan considerably more involved than Issei had anticipated when the party first set out from the settlement, a coordinated expedition to the sealed site, drawn from several of the Assembly's most capable and willing representatives. With Eleanor's party at its practical center given the Deep Current's suspected connection to her bloodline, supported by Warden Cash's own order and a small contingent of scholars and combat-capable representatives from several other territorial powers who had volunteered, with varying degrees of genuine altruism and strategic self-interest, to join the effort. That evening, gathered with the rest of their party in the modest quarters the Assembly had provided, Eleanor sat quietly for a long while before finally voicing the thought that had clearly been weighing on her since Warden Cash's revelation. 15 years, she said softly. 15 years believing I understood the full shape of what my people survived, and what we lost. I do not know how to properly hold the possibility that there was always a deeper layer to it, something even Castellan and his coalition may not have fully understood themselves. Issei took her hand, understanding the particular weight of a truth that reshaped grief rather than simply adding to it. "Whatever this turns out to be," he said, "we investigate it the same way we've investigated everything else. Carefully, honestly, and together. If there's a deeper truth about your people waiting at the bottom of this, we're going to find it properly, not guess at it out of fear." Eleanor's answering nod carried the same hard-won, steady resolve that had carried her through every previous revelation, however difficult, and the following morning, the expedition set out toward the sealed site with the full weight of an ancient mystery now settling, alongside the immediate danger of the spreading ley instability, over every member of the assembled party. The journey toward the sealed site took the expedition through territory that grew stranger and more unsettling with every passing day, the surrounding landscape carrying subtle wrongness that Sable, who had insisted on joining the expedition despite her usual preference for remaining close to the settlement's own cultivated ground, described with growing unease as the Deep Current's instability bleeding upward into the visible world. "The trees here grow wrong," she observed on the third day, studying a stand of twisted, pale bark trunks that bore little resemblance to any species Issei recognized. "Not diseased, precisely. Simply confused, as though the ground beneath them no longer properly communicates what a tree is meant to become. I have never witnessed anything quite like it, even in the earliest, most damaged stretches of our own settlement's soil before the bloodline gift began its restoration." The expedition's composition, drawn from across the gathered Assembly's volunteers, proved as varied and occasionally tense as Eleanor had anticipated, Warden Cash's own order providing careful, disciplined scholars and combat specialists, while the handful of territorial house representatives who had joined carried motivations ranging from genuine concern to the same calculating self-interest Mal Brandt had once shown toward Eleanor's own bloodline years earlier. It was one such representative, a sharp-featured devil from a minor house Issei did not recognize, who finally voiced the tension several members of the party had clearly been quietly harboring since the expedition's departure. If this Hollow King's power genuinely connects to the Duskwood bloodline the way Warden Kasha suggests, he said, addressing the gathered camp one evening with poorly disguised interest, that raises a rather significant question about what exactly we intend to do with whatever we find at that site. Reseal it, certainly, if it proves as dangerous as the disturbance suggests. But if there is genuine power there, power connected to a bloodline gift that has already proven capable of transforming entire territories, I do not think this expedition should proceed without a clearer, more formal understanding of who holds claim to whatever we ultimately uncover. Eleanor's expression, hearing this, carried the same fierce, controlled fury Issei had seen her direct at Malbrant's own cynical calculations years earlier. My people are not a resource to be claimed, she said, her voice cutting cleanly across the tense camp. Whatever we find at that site, if it connects to my bloodline's history, it connects to 15 years of grief and hiding and rebuilding that no house's claim will ever properly account for. I did not join this expedition to negotiate ownership of my own ancestors' legacy. I joined to help stop a danger that threatens every territory represented in this gathering, including, I suspect, whatever comfortable holdings your own house currently enjoys. Warden Kasha, listening from the edge of the camp with the same careful, weighted patience she had shown throughout the assembly's original deliberation, finally intervened before the tension could escalate further. This expedition operates under my orders' authority, she said, her voice carrying the particular quiet steel of someone accustomed to settling disputes among considerably more powerful factions than the party currently assembled. Whatever we discover at the sealed site will be assessed and addressed according to the danger it represents, not according to any house's territorial ambitions. I would remind every member of this expedition that our purpose here is stabilization, not acquisition, and any representative who cannot properly hold that priority is welcome to return to the assembly immediately, with my orders' full understanding and no further obligation. The sharp-featured devil's expression carried visible, grudging retreat at this clear rebuke, and though the tension did not fully dissolve, the remainder of the journey proceeded with a more careful, professional distance among the expedition's more self-interested members, Eleanor's own party drawing steadily closer to Warden Kasha's disciplined scholars as the days passed, a natural alliance built on shared, genuine purpose rather than simple strategic convenience. It was on the 5th day, cresting a final ridge that overlooked a valley shrouded in the same strange wrongness Sable had first identified in the twisted trees, that the sealed site itself finally came into view. Ancient stone ruins half swallowed by soil that pulsed, even from a considerable distance, with a sickly, unstable violet light that Issei recognized immediately, with a cold jolt of old, familiar dread, as disturbingly similar to the ruins he had first encountered in the forest clearing where his entire journey with Eleanor had begun. That is the same magic, he said quietly, watching the valley's unsettling glow with narrowed, wary eyes. Or close enough to it that I don't think it's coincidence. Eleanor's expression, studying the same distant light, carried a grim, dawning recognition that settled heavily over her entire posture. The Ashen Order's rituals, she said slowly. Whoever first developed the magic that hunted my people for 15 years, I do not believe they invented that violet corruption from nothing. I believe, looking at this valley, that they may have learned it from something considerably older, and considerably more dangerous, than even Castellan or House Verith ever properly understood. The expedition's approach into the valley itself proceeded with the same careful, disciplined caution Warden Kasha's order had shown throughout the journey, her scholars marking the ground ahead with small, precise wards designed to detect exactly the kind of instability that had injured her order's 2 previous investigation attempts, while the expedition's combat-capable members, Issei, Kiba, Offries, and a handful of Warden Kasha's own trained guardians, maintained careful watch over the party's flanks. The wrongness Sable had first identified grew steadily more pronounced as they descended, the twisted trees giving way to bare, cracked earth that seemed to actively resist the party's passage, small tremors rippling underfoot with unsettling, arrhythmic timing that bore none of the deliberate, controlled response Eleanor had learned to draw from her own bloodline gift. It does not recognize me the way our own garden's soil does, Eleanor observed, kneeling briefly to press her palm against the cracked earth, her expression carrying visible discomfort at whatever she felt through the contact. If there is truly some ancient connection between my bloodline and this place, it has been severed, or corrupted, long enough that the ground no longer responds to my presence as kin. I feel only distance. Distance, and something considerably colder beneath it. Warden Kasha, observing this exchange with careful, scholarly attention, made a note in the small journal she had carried throughout the journey. That response itself carries information, she said. My Order's 2 previous attempts reported no such distinction at all, simply hostile resistance from the moment they crossed the valley's outer boundary. Your bloodline's presence appears to register differently to whatever remains active here, even if that registration is not, as you say, warm recognition. The ruins themselves, once the party finally reached the valley's center, proved considerably more extensive than their distant silhouette had suggested, weathered stone structures arranged in a vast, concentric pattern that Varen, studying the layout with growing, focused excitement despite the valley's oppressive atmosphere, identified as bearing unmistakable resemblance to the boundary ward architecture Sable had developed for the settlement's own protection, though scaled to a size and complexity that dwarfed anything the household had ever attempted. This was built by people who understood exactly what they were containing, he said, tracing the pattern's careful, deliberate geometry with visible awe. Not a crude prison, but a properly engineered seal, layered and redundant. The same principle Sable applies to our own boundary wards, refined across what must have been considerable time and resources. Whoever built this took the danger inside with the utmost seriousness. It was at the pattern's center, where the ancient seal's structure converged around a single, deeply sunken stone platform, that the expedition finally encountered the full source of the valley's unsettling wrongness. The platform's surface cracked through in several places, sickly violet light bleeding upward through each fracture with a slow, pulsing rhythm that reminded Issei uncomfortably of a wound that refused to properly close. The seal has weakened considerably more than our Order's previous readings suggested, Warden Kasha said grimly, studying the cracked platform with careful, professional focus. I would estimate, based on the fracture pattern alone, that we have weeks remaining before it fails entirely, rather than the months my Order originally projected. Eleanor approached the platform slowly, her expression carrying the same careful, focused attention she brought to every significant magical assessment, and as she drew close enough to properly study the violet light bleeding through the cracks, something in her posture shifted suddenly, sharply, a visible jolt of recognition that made Issei's own instincts flare with immediate concern. Eleanor, he said, moving quickly to her side. I know this light, she said, her voice carrying a raw, disbelieving quality Issei had rarely heard from her. Not from the Ashen Order's rituals, though I understand now why you thought of them. From something older. A fragment of memory I have carried since childhood, from before the massacre, that I never properly understood until this exact moment. My mother once showed me a very old family heirloom, a pendant, carved with markings that glowed with exactly this same violet light when she spoke certain old words over it. She told me it was simply a keepsake, a piece of decoration passed down through many generations. I do not believe, standing here now, that it was ever simply decoration at all. The gathered party fell into tense, weighted silence at this revelation, and Warden Kasha, studying Eleanor's shaken expression with careful, deliberate attention, finally spoke the question that had clearly been forming in her mind since the Assembly's original revelation days earlier. Do you still possess this pendant? She asked quietly. Eleanor's expression carried the particular, complicated weight of grief and dawning purpose intertwined. I do, she said. I have carried it every day since the massacre, the only physical piece of my mother I managed to save from that night. I did not think, until this moment, that it might be considerably more significant than a simple keepsake. I believe, Warden Kasha, that we may need it here, and I believe I finally understand, at least in part, exactly why my mother chose to guard it so carefully all those years ago. The pendant itself, when Eleanor finally drew it carefully from beneath her traveling clothes where she had worn it hidden and close against her skin every day since the massacre, proved smaller and more unassuming than the weight of the moment suggested it should be, a simple oval of dark, weathered stone carved with markings that had faded, over what Varen estimated to be considerable generations, to little more than faint, ghostly impressions against the stone's worn surface. I have never activated it, Eleanor admitted, studying the pendant in her open palm with an expression that mixed old, careful reverence with new, uneasy curiosity. My mother taught me the words she used, when I was very young, though she made me promise never to speak them without her present. I did not understand why at the time. I assumed it was simply a mother's ordinary caution around something sentimental and old. I did not know, until this moment, that I might be standing exactly where those words were always meant to be spoken. Warden Kasha, watching the pendant with the same careful, scholarly focus she brought to every significant discovery, finally spoke into the tense silence that had settled over the gathered expedition. I would not recommend activating it without considerable caution, she said. Whatever connection it carries to this site, we do not yet understand its full nature or risk. But I confess, given the seal's rapidly weakening state, I am not certain we possess the luxury of extensive additional study before some action becomes necessary regardless. Eleanor's expression, weighing this careful warning against the mounting urgency of the seal's visible deterioration, finally settled into the same hard, deliberate resolve Issei had watched carry her through every previous impossible decision. Then I will not activate it recklessly, she said. But I will not simply stand here, either, while a seal my own ancestors may have helped build continues failing around us. Issei, stay close. Warden Kasha, if something goes wrong, I trust your order's judgment to intervene however proves necessary. Issei's protest died in his throat before he could fully voice it, recognizing, in the fierce, determined set of Eleanor's jaw, the same unshakable resolve that had once carried her into a combat circle against Offries rather than allow anyone else to bear that particular weight on her behalf. He settled instead for taking her free hand in his own, offering the same steady, wordless support that had carried them both through every significant trial of their remarkable life together. Eleanor closed her eyes, drew a slow, steadying breath, and spoke the old words her mother had taught her, her voice carrying a careful, deliberate weight through syllables that belonged, Issei recognized even without understanding their meaning, to a considerably older form of the Duskwood tongue than anything he had heard even from Marin's own careful, traditional speech. The pendant's response was immediate and overwhelming, violet light flaring bright enough to make several members of the gathered expedition shield their eyes, the faded carvings across its surface blazing suddenly vivid and sharp, and for one long, suspended moment, the entire valley seemed to hold its breath around them, the cracked platform's own sickly light pulsing in sudden, unmistakable rhythm with the pendant's blazing response. Then, without warning, the world around Eleanor and Issei seemed to fold inward, the valley's ruins and gathered expedition dissolving into something that felt less like a physical location and more like a memory experienced directly, vivid and immersive, and Issei found himself standing, alongside Eleanor, in a version of this same valley considerably older, the ruins whole and freshly built. Surrounded by figures whose faces bore the unmistakable, ancient bearing of the earliest Duskwood ancestors, working together in careful, coordinated ritual around the very platform that now, in their own time, lay cracked and failing. They were not simply containing something, Eleanor said softly, watching the vision unfold with wide, disbelieving eyes. They were binding themselves to it. Look, Issei. That is not a prison being built around a captive force. That is a covenant, a bond deliberately, permanently forged between my ancestors and whatever power slept beneath this valley, a promise to hold it in careful balance rather than simply lock it away and forget it existed. The vision continued unfolding around them, Eleanor and Issei watching as the ancient Duskwood ancestors completed their careful, coordinated ritual, and at its center, rising from the platform in a form that Issei's mind struggled to properly hold steady, something vast and ancient, and neither wholly malevolent nor wholly benign settled into the earth beneath their feet, bound not through force alone but through the willing, generational covenant the assembled ancestors had just finished forging. A voice, when it finally came, carried no sound Issei could properly place, resonating instead directly through the vision itself, ancient and weary and carrying a weight that felt, somehow, considerably closer to grief than menace. You bind me not as prisoner, but as partner in this balance, the voice said, and Eleanor's grip on Issei's hand tightened involuntarily at the words. I am the current beneath your currents, the root beneath your roots. Bound too tightly, I wither, and the land withers with me. Bound too loosely, I overflow, and the land drowns in what I carry. Your bloodline's covenant is the careful, patient work of keeping that balance, generation after generation, for as long as you choose to honor it. The vision began to dissolve, the ancient ritual and its participants fading gradually back into the valley's present, cracked and failing state, and as the last threads of the memory released its hold, Eleanor staggered slightly, caught immediately by Issei's steadying arm, her expression carrying the full, overwhelming weight of everything she had just witnessed. It was never a prison, she said, once she had recovered enough to properly speak, addressing the gathered, anxiously waiting expedition with a voice still rough from the vision's lingering weight. It was a covenant, a partnership between my ancestors and whatever ancient power sleeps beneath this valley, maintained faithfully across countless generations until the massacre severed that connection 15 years ago. The seal is not failing because something evil is trying to break free. It is failing because the bloodline meant to maintain the covenant's careful balance has been scattered and broken for 15 years, with no one properly tending the bond at all. Warden Kasha, absorbing this revelation with visible, dawning understanding, finally spoke into the stunned silence that had settled over the gathered expedition. That would explain everything our order's readings have struggled to properly account for, she said slowly. Not an escalating attack, but a slow, patient unraveling, precisely the kind of deterioration one would expect from a carefully maintained system suddenly, catastrophically abandoned. If your bloodline's restoration these past 5 years has already begun stabilizing surface-level ley currents across your own settlement's territory, it stands to reason the covenant itself might respond to properly, deliberately renewed attention. Eleanor's expression, hearing this, carried a complicated mixture of relief and fresh, daunting weight. You are suggesting the solution is not resealing this site through force, she said, but renewing the covenant properly, the way my ancestors originally intended. I believe so, Warden Kasha said carefully. Though I do not pretend to know precisely what renewing such an ancient covenant would properly require, nor what it might cost the one who undertakes it. This is knowledge our order has never possessed. It exists, as of this moment, only within you, and whatever your bloodline's collective memory and magic can help you properly recover. Issei, watching Eleanor absorb the full weight of this revelation, felt the same old, familiar protective instinct rise sharply in his chest, tempered now by 5 years of hard-won understanding that some burdens could not simply be carried on her behalf, however much he wished otherwise. What does renewing it actually look like, he asked. Practically? What do you need to do right now standing here? Eleanor considered the question carefully, her hand still wrapped tightly around the pendant, its violet glow now settled into a steady, gentler pulse rather than the overwhelming flare of its initial activation. I do not fully know, she admitted. But I believe, based on what the vision showed me, that it requires more than simply my own presence and effort alone. My ancestors renewed this covenant together, an entire community bound in shared, deliberate purpose, not a single heir working in isolation. I do not think I can properly restore what 15 years of scattering broke, standing here with only this small expedition beside me. She turned, then, toward Varen, toward Sable, toward the whole gathered party who had followed her into this ancient, uncertain danger, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same fierce, hopeful resolve that had once carried her through every previous impossible chapter of her people's long, difficult restoration. I believe we need to bring my people here, she said. Properly, deliberately, the way my ancestors once gathered to forge this covenant in the first place. Not simply my own bloodline heir's effort, but the restored community itself, standing together at the site where it all began, choosing, collectively and consciously, to renew a promise 15 years of grief and hiding once nearly severed for good. The logistics of gathering an entire scattered people to a remote, dangerous valley within the narrow window Warden Kasha's readings suggested the seal still had remaining proved, in the days that followed, one of the most demanding coordinated efforts the household had ever undertaken, considerably more complex than any previous council proceeding or diplomatic negotiation, and it was Rias, returning swiftly to the assembly to formally request the council's full support, who ultimately secured the resources needed to move both the settlements and the Hollow's populations across considerable distance in a fraction of the time such a journey would ordinarily require. We do not have weeks to spare for a careful, gradual gathering, she reported back to Eleanor, and the expedition, having negotiated emergency transport arrangements through several allied houses whose own territories, she noted grimly, had already begun showing early signs of the same lay instability spreading elsewhere. Every house represented at that assembly has a direct stake in this seal holding. I did not have to argue very hard to secure their cooperation. Word reached the settlement and the hollows simultaneously through Aquino's swiftest channels, and the response, when it came, carried a unity that Issei found himself deeply moved by even amid the mounting urgency of the crisis, both communities mobilizing within days rather than the weeks such a significant undertaking might reasonably have required. Families packing what they could carry and trusting the household's careful coordination to manage the considerable logistics of transporting hundreds of people across unfamiliar, potentially dangerous territory. Marin herself, arriving at the head of the Hollow's own contingent, embraced Eleanor with the same fierce warmth she had shown at their very first meeting years earlier, her expression carrying the particular gravity of someone who understood exactly what was being asked of her people, even without yet fully grasping the ancient covenant's precise details. You are asking my people to walk directly into the danger our isolation once kept us safely apart from, she said, though her tone carried no accusation, only careful, weighted acknowledgement. I want you to know, before we take a single step toward that valley, that the Hollow's Council did not hesitate in its decision to come. Whatever this covenant requires, we intend to stand with you exactly as fully as your own settlement will. Eleanor's eyes carried bright, immediate emotion at this declaration, and the gathering that assembled over the following days, drawing together nearly the settlements and the Hollow's entire combined population, families who had once believed themselves scattered fragments of a dying people now converging, deliberately and in full, urgent purpose, toward the same ancient site where their ancestors had first forged the covenant, now hanging by its final, fraying threads. The journey itself, coordinated through the emergency transport arrangements Rias had secured, carried the combined communities across the remaining distance in barely 2 days, considerably faster than the original expedition's own careful, cautious approach, and it was as the vast, gathered population finally crested the same ridge overlooking the valley that Issei had first climbed with the smaller expedition days earlier, that he felt the full, staggering weight of exactly what Eleanor's request had ultimately assembled, hundreds of Duskwood men, women, and children, spanning every generation from the Hollow's oldest surviving elders to infants born directly into the settlement's hard-won peace, gathered together at the edge of the very valley where their entire people's ancient purpose had first begun. They are ready, Marin told Eleanor quietly, watching the assembled community settle into careful, respectful formation along the valley's ridge. Whatever you need from us, Eleanor, however this covenant is properly renewed, I believe you will find every single person gathered here prepared to give it fully, without hesitation. Eleanor, standing at the ridge's edge with Issei beside her and Corin held carefully in her arms, having insisted, against Issei's initial worried protest, that their son be present for whatever came next, looked out over her assembled, restored people with an expression that carried the full, overwhelming weight of 15 years of grief finally, completely transformed into something worth every ounce of that difficult journey. Then let us finish what our ancestors began, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, and together, we will keep the promise 15 years of fire and scattering once nearly broke beyond repair. The ritual that followed unfolded across the remainder of that day and deep into the night, Eleanor working closely with Varen's careful historical reconstruction of the vision's fragmented details and Sable's practical understanding of how the bloodline gift's living magic actually responded to deliberate, collective cultivation. The two of them helping shape a ceremony that honored the ancient covenant's original structure while accounting for everything the restoration's 5 hard years had taught them about how the gift genuinely worked in practice. We cannot simply recreate what our ancestors did generations ago, Sable explained to the assembled community elders, both from the settlement and the Hollow, as the ritual's final preparations were laid out across the valley's ancient, concentric ruins. But I believe, having studied how the gift has responded to genuine, collective devotion these past 5 years, that the underlying principle remains the same. Not simply power directed at the seal, but connection, freely and consciously offered by everyone gathered here, The same way an entire community's daily choice to stay and tend a garden eventually roots something considerably stronger than any single person's effort alone. The ceremony's structure, once finalized, called for the community to gather in concentric rings around the ancient platform, mirroring the very pattern Varen had first identified in the ruins' architecture, with Eleanor positioned at the center alongside the pendant, her mother's careful gift finally, fully understood in the context its original purpose had always intended. Fenna, whose own growing connection to the bloodline gift had continued deepening under Sable's patient guidance, stood immediately beside her, alongside Thessaly and several of the Hollow's own most gifted practitioners, forming an inner circle intended to help channel and stabilize whatever response the wider community's collective devotion managed to draw forth. As the sun set fully behind the valleys surrounding ridges, Eleanor began the ceremony with the same old words her mother had once taught her, though this time she spoke them not alone but with the entire gathered community's voices rising to join hers, hundreds of Duskwood men, women, and children speaking the ancient covenant's renewal together. Their combined voices carrying an unmistakable weight that made even Issei's own untrained senses feel the valley's very air shift in response. The pendant flared bright once more, its violet light spreading now not merely from Eleanor's hand but rippling outward across the entire gathered community, catching and amplifying through every voice raised in the shared ceremony, and the platform at the valley's center responded in kind, its cracked, failing light beginning, for the first time since the expedition's original arrival, to steady into something considerably calmer and more controlled. "It is working," Warden Kasia said, her voice carrying disbelieving wonder as she monitored the shifting readings across her order's careful instruments. "The instability is receding, not simply here, but across the readings we are still receiving from the other affected territories as well. The Covenant is properly, actively renewing itself." The ceremony's climax arrived as full darkness settled over the valley, the ancient voice Issei and Eleanor had heard within the earlier vision finally, briefly manifesting once more, resonating not through sound but through the very ground beneath the gathered community's feet, a presence considerably calmer and more settled than its earlier, weakened state had suggested. "You return to me, scattered but not broken," the voice said, and Eleanor's answering voice, carrying clearly across the ceremony's hushed, reverent silence, rose in response with the same fierce, unwavering resolve that had carried her through every previous impossible chapter of her people's long restoration. "We return to you as we are," she said. "Restored, reunited, and choosing, freely and together, to renew what 15 years of grief once nearly severed beyond repair. We do not offer this covenant out of fear any longer, nor out of the fragile desperation that first forged it in some ancient, uncertain age. We offer it out of genuine, deliberate choice, a people who have already proven, across 5 hard years of patient rebuilding, exactly what we are capable of when we choose connection over isolation, honesty over hiding, and each other over every danger the world has thrown against us." The ground's response carried a warmth that Issei felt even through his own limited magical senses, the platform's violet light finally settling into a steady, gentle glow considerably closer to Eleanor's own garden's ancient magic than the sickly instability that had first drawn the expedition to this valley, and as the ceremony finally concluded, the gathered community's collective voices fading into exhausted, wondering silence, Warden Kasia's instruments confirmed what every member of the assembled crowd could already feel settling steadily into the valley's newly stabilized air. "The seal holds," she reported, her voice carrying genuine, relieved wonder. "Not merely holds. It is stronger, more stable, than our order's readings have ever recorded it. Whatever your people just accomplished here tonight, Eleanor of the Duskwood line, I believe you have not simply resealed an ancient danger. You have properly, fully restored a covenant that has waited 15 years for exactly this moment to finally come home." The days following the covenant's renewal carried the gathered communities through a celebration considerably more solemn and reverent than any previous milestone in the restoration's long, remarkable history, the valley itself transforming visibly under the community's continued presence, the twisted, confused trees Sable had first noted on their approach beginning, slowly and steadily, to straighten and green under the covenant's newly stabilized influence, and the cracked, hostile earth, softening into something considerably closer to the warm, welcoming soil the settlement's own garden had cultivated over 5 patient years. Warden Kasha, remaining at the valley alongside her order to properly document and monitor the Covenant's ongoing stabilization, approached Eleanor on the celebration's final evening with an expression that carried genuine, careful respect rather than the cautious, evaluating distance she had maintained throughout the earlier stages of their acquaintance. My order will need to properly revise a great deal of our understanding regarding the deep current's foundational structure, she admitted. We believed, for generations, that such ancient dangers required force or careful containment, power exercised over power. I do not believe any of our scholars fully considered that the proper answer might simply be relationship, faithfully, freely renewed. I confess I find myself considerably humbled by what your people demonstrated here. Eleanor's expression, hearing this, carried the same quiet, settled warmth that had become increasingly present in her across the preceding years. My people have learned, across considerable hardship, that connection freely chosen accomplishes what force alone never properly can, she said. I am grateful your order was wise enough to recognize that lesson might apply here as well, rather than continuing to attempt solutions built on containment and control. The formal assembly's final proceeding, convened once the expedition and gathered communities had returned to the original gathering grounds, carried an entirely different tenor than the anxious, uncertain gathering that had first called them together weeks earlier, Warden Kasha's full report on the Covenant's successful renewal drawing genuine, widespread celebration from representatives whose own territories had already begun reporting the same steady stabilization the valley itself had first demonstrated. The Duskwood restoration has done considerably more than resolve a single dangerous seal, Warden Kasha announced to the assembled representatives, her voice carrying formal, unmistakable gravity. It has demonstrated, for the first time in recorded history, a properly renewed covenant capable of stabilizing the deep current at its very foundation. I would recommend, and my order will formally support, that this assembly recognize the Duskwood bloodline's role not simply as one territorial power among many, but as genuine, essential stewards of the region's foundational magical stability, a role deserving of formal protection and support from every house and territory whose own stability now depends, whether previously understood or not, on this covenant's continued careful maintenance. The assembly's formal recognition that followed, drafted over the following days with careful attention from Rias and the settlement's own growing diplomatic experience, established protections and formal support for the Duskwood restoration considerably beyond anything even House Corvain's substantial reparations had previously provided, a genuine, wide-reaching acknowledgement of exactly how essential Eleanor's scattered, nearly destroyed people had proven themselves to be, not merely to their own restoration, but to the fundamental stability of the entire region's shared magic. Standing together at the edge of the assembly grounds as the formal proceeding finally concluded, Eleanor and Issei watched the gathered representatives disperse with a satisfaction that carried none of the hard, weary vigilance of their earlier confrontations against Vareth, Castellan, or even House Corvain's complicated reckoning, only the quiet, settled wonder of watching an ancient promise, once nearly lost entirely to fire and grief, finally, fully restored to its proper, essential place in the world. We came here not knowing what we would find, Eleanor said softly, watching Corin, now old enough to toddle determinately across the grounds chasing after Ren's careful, patient supervision, his small, delighted laughter carrying clearly across the emptying assembly. I do not think either of us expected to learn our people's original purpose ran considerably deeper than either grief or simple territorial gift. We are not merely survivors who rebuilt what was taken from us, Issei. We are, it turns out, exactly what my ancestors always intended us to be, the ones who keep the deepest balance, faithfully, generation after generation. Issei, watching her with the same steady, settled love that had carried him through every remarkable chapter of their shared life together, felt the full weight of that revelation settle warmly into his own chest. Then I guess we've got some new traditions to build into that settlement school curriculum, he said, smiling. Because I have a feeling Corin's generation is going to need to understand exactly what kind of responsibility they're growing up into. Eleanor's answering laugh carried across the quiet evening air, warm and unguarded and entirely certain, and together, they turned to gather their son and begin the long, content to journey home, carrying with them not merely victory over another danger successfully faced, but the full, restored understanding of exactly what their remarkable, hard-won family had always, truly been building toward. The homecoming, when the household's core family finally returned to the settlement after weeks away, drew a celebration that rivaled even the sister settlement's original founding ceremony, word of the covenant's renewal and the assembly's formal recognition having traveled ahead of them through Aquino's swift channels, and the settlement's entire population turned out to welcome their returning family with the particular, overwhelming warmth of a community that understood exactly how significant the preceding week's journey had actually been. Asia, waiting at the settlement's gate with a considerably more mobile and vocal Corin than the version who had departed weeks earlier, embraced Eleanor with visible relief. "He asked for you every single day," she said, laughing through happy tears as Eleanor gathered her son into her arms. "I do not think he entirely understood where you had gone, but he understood, quite clearly, that he wanted you back." The settlement's council, gathering that same evening to properly hear the full account of everything the expedition had discovered and accomplished, listened with the same rapt, reverent attention the wider assembly had shown, and it was Varen, presenting his own careful documentation of the Covenant's vision and the ancient ritual's proper renewal, who finally addressed the question that had clearly been weighing on several council members since the household's return. "What does this mean, practically, for the settlement going forward?" he asked, though the question carried the particular weight of someone who already suspected the answer carried considerable significance. "If our bloodline is now formally recognized as steward of the deep current itself, does that responsibility fall to Eleanor alone, or does it properly belong to our entire restored people?" Eleanor, considering the question with the same careful, deliberate weight she brought to every significant decision, finally offered an answer that carried the full accumulated wisdom of everything the preceding 5 years had taught her about the true nature of shared responsibility. "It belongs to all of us," she said. "The covenant renewed itself through collective devotion, not my effort alone, and I believe maintaining it properly will require exactly that same collective commitment, generation after generation, the same patient way we have already learned to maintain everything else worth protecting. I do not intend to carry this responsibility as some solitary burden. I intend, instead, to teach it properly, to Fenna, to Corin when he is old enough, to every child born into this restoration who chooses to learn the old traditions and carry them forward." The council's discussion that followed carried the same thoughtful, deliberate energy of every previous significant transition the settlement had navigated together, and by the evening's end, a formal plan had begun taking shape. Regular pilgrimages to the valley to properly maintain the Covenant's renewed strength. An expanded curriculum within the settlement's school specifically dedicated to teaching the deeper history and responsibility Warden Cash's revelation had uncovered, and a formal partnership with Warden Cash's own order to ensure the Covenant's ongoing health remained properly, collaboratively monitored rather than resting on any single community's shoulders alone. It was late that same evening, once the council meeting had finally concluded and the settlement had settled into its familiar, peaceful nighttime rhythm, that Issei found Eleanor once more beneath the persimmon tree, Corin finally, contentedly asleep in his own small bed, the pendant resting now in a place of honor within their home rather than hidden beneath her traveling clothes. Its violet glow settled permanently into the same steady, gentle pulse the Covenant's renewal had finally, fully restored. "I keep thinking about what the voice said," Eleanor admitted, watching the garden's familiar, ancient magic settle around them in the warm evening quiet. "Bound too tightly it withers. Bound too loosely it overflows." I have spent 5 years believing our restoration was primarily about survival, about rebuilding what fire and grief once took from us. I understand now that it was always about something considerably larger, a balance our people are meant to help maintain, not merely for ourselves, but for every territory and bloodline whose own stability quietly depends on choices we make, generation after generation, about how faithfully we honor that responsibility. Issei settled beside her, watching the same steady, ancient light pulse gently through the garden's familiar dark. "That's a lot to carry," he said. "But I don't think you're carrying it the way you're afraid you might be. Look at everything that actually happened out there. Not you alone, forcing some ancient danger back into submission. An entire restored people, choosing together, freely, to honor a promise their ancestors made generations ago. That's not a burden settling on your shoulders alone. That's exactly what you've been building this whole time, whether you fully understood it yet or not. Eleanor's answering smile carried the same settled, hard-won peace that had come to define so much of their remarkable life together, and above them, through the persimmon tree's familiar canopy, the stars settled bright and steady over a garden, a settlement, and an entire restored people who had finally, fully understood not merely what they had survived, but what, all along, they had truly been meant to become. The months that followed the Covenant's renewal carried the settlement through a season of quiet, steady transformation, the formal partnership with Warden Cash's order bringing a small, permanent contingent of scholars to establish residence near the settlement's edge, tasked with the ongoing, collaborative study of exactly how the deep current's stability might best be maintained across future generations. Fenna, whose own connection to the bloodline gift had continued its remarkable growth since the Covenant's renewal, took to this new scholarly partnership with visible enthusiasm, spending long hours working alongside Warden Cash's own researchers to properly document everything the ancient ritual's rediscovery had revealed. I never imagined, growing up entirely ignorant of my own heritage, that I would someday be helping write the proper history of what that heritage actually means, she admitted to Varen one afternoon, both of them bent over a shared collection of notes in the settlement's growing archive. My grandmother spent her whole life terrified of a name she barely understood. I spend my days now helping the wider world properly understand exactly how significant that name has always actually been. Varen's answering smile carried the particular warmth of a man who had watched, across 5 remarkable years, an entire scattered people transform grief into genuine, hard-won purpose. That is, I think, the truest measure of everything this restoration has accomplished, he said. Not simply survival, not even simple justice against those who once tried to destroy your people. The chance to properly understand, and proudly claim, exactly what your bloodline has always meant, both to yourselves and to the wider world that once feared what it never bothered to properly comprehend. The settlement's regular pilgrimages to the valley, established as part of the Council's formal plan for maintaining the Covenant's renewed strength, quickly became one of the community's most treasured traditions, families rotating through the responsibility on a careful schedule Sable had designed, ensuring the ancient site received steady, faithful attention without placing undue burden on any single family or generation. Corin, though still too young to properly understand the significance of the journeys, had already begun accompanying his parents on several such pilgrimages, and Eleanor found herself, watching her son toddle happily through the valley's now thoroughly transformed, thriving landscape, struck repeatedly by the particular, quiet miracle of raising a child who would grow up understanding this sacred responsibility not as grief inherited from tragedy, but as genuine, joyful purpose passed down through generations of careful, faithful love. It was during one such pilgrimage, several months after the Covenant's original renewal, that Warden Kasha herself, having taken to visiting the settlement with increasing regularity as her order's partnership with the community deepened, raised a subject that carried, Issei sensed immediately from her careful, measured tone, considerably more weight than her usual scholarly updates. My order's continued study of the deep current has revealed something I believe you should know directly, rather than through a formal report, she told Eleanor and Issei one evening, as the pilgrimage party settled around their evening fire beneath the valley's now thoroughly restored, healthy canopy. Your covenant is not the only such bond our order has identified across the region's history. There are others, considerably older records suggest, other ancient bloodlines once tasked with similarly essential stewardship, scattered across territories our current maps do not fully cover. Some, our research suggests, may still exist, in some form, wherever their own descendants managed to survive whatever history eventually scattered them. Eleanor's expression, absorbing this revelation, carried the same careful, dawning weight that had marked every previous significant discovery of the Restoration's remarkable journey. You are suggesting there may be other peoples, she said slowly, other bloodlines, facing something similar to what my own people once faced, scattered and hidden and unaware of the deeper purpose their own heritage was always meant to serve. It is possible, Warden Kasha said carefully. I do not say this to burden you with a task beyond your own restoration's considerable, ongoing work. I say it because I believe, given everything your people have accomplished these past 5 years, you may be uniquely positioned to recognize such a bloodline, and to offer them exactly the kind of patient, honest guidance that helped your own restoration succeed where isolation and fear once nearly ensured its complete destruction. Eleanor and Issei exchanged a long, considering glance across the pilgrimage's quiet evening fire, the same wordless understanding that had carried them through every significant decision of their remarkable shared life together passing silently between them, and when Eleanor finally spoke again, her voice carried the same fierce, hopeful resolve that had first drawn Issei to stand beside her in a forest clearing so many years earlier. Then perhaps our restoration's next chapter is not simply about tending what we have already built, she said. Perhaps it is about helping others find their way toward exactly the same kind of homecoming we were fortunate enough to discover, one patient, honest, deliberate choice at a time. Warden Cash's expression, hearing this response, carried the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who had hoped for exactly this answer without wishing to presume it. My order will begin compiling what fragmentary records we possess, she said. It will take time, considerable care, and very likely several false starts before we identify anything concrete enough to act upon. I do not offer this as an urgent new crisis demanding immediate attention. I offer it, instead, as a possibility your restoration may wish to hold gently, and prepare for thoughtfully, whenever the proper moment eventually arrives to act on it. That is precisely how we intend to hold it, Eleanor said. Gently, and with considerable patience. I have learned, across 5 remarkable years, that the truest kind of restoration is never rushed into being. It is built, carefully, one honest choice at a time, by people willing to trust that the work is worth however long it takes to properly finish. That night, once the pilgrimage party had settled into sleep around the valley's quiet, glowing fire, Issei remained awake a while longer, watching Eleanor sleep peacefully beside him with Corin nestled between them, and found his thoughts drifting back, as they often did on quiet nights like this one, across the whole remarkable span of the years since a chained, exhausted stranger had first looked up at him in a ruined forest clearing. He thought of Thessaly's first wary bow beneath the persimmon tree, of Varen's trembling confession at their fence line, of Offrey's kneeling defeated in a combat circle only to find, eventually, a genuine home among the very people she had once been paid to stand against. He thought of Marin's careful, hopeful trust, of Lady Seraphine's costly public confession, of Fenna's quiet grief transformed into scholarly purpose, of Ilsa's redemption, of Corin's easy, fearless laughter, a child who had never once needed to understand what it meant to run. Every single one of them had found their way here through some version of the same difficult choice, he realized, watching the valley's restored magic pulse gently in the surrounding dark. Choosing honesty over comfortable hiding. Choosing connection over isolation. Choosing to stay and build something worth the considerable cost of building it, rather than simply surviving whatever the world had already taken from them. Eleanor stirred beside him, waking just enough to notice him still sitting upright, and reached for his hand with the same easy, instinctive warmth that had carried them through every significant moment of their life together. You are thinking too loudly, she murmured, half asleep. I can feel it, even through my own dreams. Just thinking about everyone who got us here, he said quietly. All the people who chose to stay, all the way back to Thessaly's first bough under our garden's tree. It's a lot, when you actually count it all up. It is, Eleanor agreed, fully awake now, watching him with the same quiet, settled warmth that had become so wonderfully ordinary across their years together. And I suspect, if Warden Cash's suspicions about other scattered bloodlines prove accurate, we are only at the beginning of how many more such choices this particular story still has left to hold. Issei considered that, watching the valley's steady, restored light pulse gently around their small, sleeping camp, the whole shape of whatever future still waited beyond this quiet night settling, not with anxiety, but with the same patient, hopeful readiness that had carried this remarkable family through everything that had come before. Then I guess we'd better get some sleep, he said, smiling. Sounds like we've got some new roads to figure out how to walk. Together, Eleanor said the same simple, unbreakable promise that had carried them through every chapter of their extraordinary shared life, and settled back against his shoulder, already drifting back towards sleep with the easy, trusting peace of someone who no longer needed to fear what the coming dawn might ask of her. Outside their small camp, the valley's ancient, newly restored magic settled into its own steady, patient rhythm, the covenant renewed and thriving, the deep current flowing calm and balanced beneath a landscape that had, in the span of a single remarkable season, transformed from a source of ancient dread into a genuine, thriving sanctuary, and somewhere beyond the valley's protective ridges, scattered across territories the settlement's maps did not yet properly cover, other bloodlines, other scattered peoples, waited unknowingly for the same patient, hopeful kind of homecoming that had once, against every terrible odd, found its way to a chained stranger in a forest clearing, and grown, one deliberate, stubborn, loving choice at a time, into everything it had finally, remarkably become. Varen, keeping his own quiet watch a short distance from the sleeping camp, added one final note to his careful historical record before finally allowing himself to rest. A simple line meant to mark this particular night among everything else his patient documentation had preserved across the Restoration's remarkable years. Tonight, he wrote, the Covenant slept easy beneath a valley full of people who chose, freely and completely, to come home. Whatever chapters still remain to be written, I suspect this settlement's children will read this one, someday, and understand exactly what it means to build something worth trusting the future with. The pilgrimage party made its way back toward the settlement the following morning, the valley's restored, healthy canopy filtering warm morning light across the path Eleanor's ancestors had first carved generations earlier, and it was Marin, who had insisted on joining this particular pilgrimage alongside a small delegation from the Hollow, who finally voiced something she had clearly been considering throughout the quiet journey home. I have lived long enough to witness a great many changes in our people's fortunes, she said, walking beside Eleanor with the easy familiarity 5 years of steady friendship had built between them. Isolation, then reunion, then this, a restoration considerably deeper and more significant than any of us properly understood when Solene first carried word of your settlement across our mountains. I confess I did not expect, at my age, to witness our people's story grow quite this large. Does it frighten you? Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. This new responsibility, this formal recognition, the possibility of other scattered bloodlines waiting somewhere beyond our current understanding. Marin considered the question with the same careful, deliberate weight she brought to every significant matter. A little, she admitted. Change of this scale always carries some fear alongside its hope. But I find, watching your son grow up entirely free of the fear that shaped both our own childhoods, that the fear matters considerably less than the hope does. Whatever this new chapter asks of our people, I trust we have already proven, across these past 5 years, exactly what we are capable of building when we choose faith over fear, patience over panic, and each other over every danger the world continues to place in our path. Eleanor's answering smile carried the same warm, settled gratitude she had shown Marin since their very first meeting years earlier, and the party continued its journey homeward through the transformed, thriving valley in comfortable, contented quiet, the whole shape of the future stretching ahead of them, uncertain in its particulars but steady and hopeful in its foundation, built as it was on 5 remarkable years of patient, deliberate choosing. By the time the settlement's familiar timber homes and lamplit streets finally came into view on the horizon, Corin had fallen asleep against Issei's shoulder, worn out from the journey's early morning start, and Eleanor, watching her small, peacefully sleeping son with the same fierce, unwavering love that had carried her through every difficult season of the preceding years, felt the full, settled weight of everything her people had built, survived, and finally, completely reclaimed settle warmly into her chest. Welcome home, she murmured, more to the settlement itself than to anyone walking beside her, and Issei, hearing the quiet, contented certainty in her voice, understood that whatever new chapter still waited beyond the horizon, scattered bloodlines, ancient covenants, or simply the ordinary, precious work of raising their son in a world finally worth raising him in. They would meet every single one of them exactly as they always had, patient, honest, and entirely, unshakably together. As the party passed through the settlement's gate, the familiar lamps still glowing steady in their own hallway window despite weeks away, several settlement children broke from their evening games to run alongside the returning pilgrims, delighted at the sight of their community's leader's home safely once more, and Ren, spotting Corin stirring awake against Issei's shoulder, hurried forward with the same eager, devoted enthusiasm she had shown him since his very first days, already chattering about everything he had missed during the family's journey. Eleanor watched the small, joyful reunion unfold around them with a warmth that had, over 5 remarkable years, become as natural to her as breathing, the particular, hard-won miracle of an ordinary homecoming, unremarkable to anyone who had never known what it cost to build, and utterly precious to everyone who had. The lead, when it finally arrived nearly 4 months after Warden Cash's original suggestion, came not through her order's careful, methodical archival research but through an unexpected source considerably closer to home, a trading caravan passing near the settlement's outer boundary whose lead merchant, upon hearing fragments of the Duskwood restoration's now widely known story from his own crew, had approached Rias directly with an account that immediately drew the household's full, urgent attention. There is a clan in the Eastern Territories, considerably beyond any border our council's authority properly extends to, the merchant explained, seated somewhat nervously in the settlement's council hall before Rias, Eleanor, and Varen's careful, attentive audience. They call themselves the Tie-Bound, and I confess I did not think much of the stories surrounding them until I heard your own people's history described in such similar terms. They are said to carry a bloodline gift tied to coastal currents, keeping the waters calm for the territories that claim them, though I have also heard, from crew who traded there personally, that the territory's ruling house treats them less as honored stewards and more as a resource to be carefully managed and exploited. Eleanor's expression, hearing this account, carried the same fierce, immediate recognition Issei had seen from her at every previous revelation touching her people's own history. That is not stewardship, she said, her voice hardening. That is exploitation dressed in convenient language, exactly the kind of arrangement my own people were nearly destroyed to prevent ever properly forming. Varen, listening with the same sharp historical focus he brought to every significant lead, leaned forward with visible, urgent interest. If this clan's gift genuinely connects to the same category of ancient covenant Warden Cash's order identified, he said, then whatever exploitation this ruling house has imposed on them may be causing exactly the kind of destabilization our own covenant once suffered under 15 years of scattered neglect. A bloodline gift bound by coercion rather than freely, faithfully maintained connection. Rias, considering the account with her own careful, strategic attention, finally spoke into the room's mounting urgency. We do not yet know enough to act, she said. We know a merchant's second-hand account, filtered through crew gossip and incomplete understanding of what he actually witnessed. Before we commit this household's resources to another significant expedition, I want considerably more certainty about what we would actually be walking into, and what kind of ruling house we would potentially be confronting. Eleanor's expression carried visible, restrained urgency, though she nodded at the wisdom of Rias's caution. Then we gather that certainty quickly, she said. If this tie-bound clan is genuinely suffering the way this merchant's account suggests, every week we spend carefully verifying the situation is a week they continue suffering under it. I do not intend to rush in recklessly, Rias. But I do not intend to move slowly either, not when my own people's history makes the stakes of delay so painfully clear. The household's subsequent investigation, coordinated through Aquino's network alongside Warden Cash's own order, whose careful archival research had, in the intervening months, uncovered several fragmentary historical references to a coastal covenant bloodline matching the merchant's account, confirmed within 2 weeks considerably more than any of them had hoped to learn so quickly. And considerably more troubling than even Eleanor's immediate, fierce suspicion had anticipated. The ruling house, identified through Warden Cash's records as House Marlowe, has maintained formal, generations-old control over the tie-bound clan's territory through a legal arrangement so thoroughly normalized within that region that few outside observers ever properly questioned it, Warden Cash reported. Having traveled personally to the settlement once her order's research reached sufficient confirmation to warrant direct discussion. The tie-bound are not formally enslaved, in the sense your own council's laws would recognize and prohibit. They are bound instead through generations of careful, systematic dependency, denied education, denied wealth, denied any genuine alternative to serving House Marlowe's interests, until the arrangement simply became, in that region's understanding, the natural order of things rather than the deliberate exploitation it has always actually been. Eleanor's expression, absorbing this account, carried the same hard, unwavering resolve that had carried her through every previous confrontation with injustice, tempered now by 5 years of hard-won wisdom about exactly how patient and careful such confrontations often needed to be. "Then we go there," she said. "Not with force, not yet, not until we understand fully what these people themselves actually want and need. But we go, and we offer them exactly what my own people were once offered, the simple, honest choice 15 years of hiding once denied us entirely." The expedition that departed for the Eastern Territories carried a composition considerably different from any the household had previously assembled, Eleanor insisting on including not merely the usual core party but Marin herself, whose own experience navigating the delicate, difficult work of trust-building with a wary, controlled community made her insight invaluable for whatever similarly careful diplomacy the tie-bound situation would likely demand. Fenna joined as well, her own scholarly partnership with Warden Cash's order having deepened her understanding of Covenant bloodline magic considerably, and Offrey's, whose knowledge of exactly how coercive, generations-old arrangements typically maintained their grip on those trapped within them, rounded out the party's practical expertise. The journey itself took considerably longer than any previous expedition, nearly 3 weeks of travel through territory that grew steadily more unfamiliar, and it was during this extended journey that Eleanor found herself, more than once, turning over the particular weight of what she was about to attempt with a caution Issei recognized as considerably more careful than even her original approach toward the Hollow years earlier. "I do not want to simply arrive and declare myself their liberator," she admitted to Issei one evening, watching the unfamiliar eastern stars through their camp's small fire. "That framing would place me in exactly the same position House Marlowe currently occupies, someone deciding what is best for the tie-bound rather than genuinely listening to what they themselves want." I remember, vividly, how carefully Marin approached our own reunion, offering possibility rather than presumption. I intend to extend the tie-bound exactly that same respect, however urgent their situation may prove to be. Marin, overhearing this from her own place near the fire, nodded with visible approval. "That is precisely the wisdom I hoped you would bring to this," she said. "I confess, when your own party first arrived at the Hollow's gate, I was prepared for exactly the kind of presumption you are now working so carefully to avoid. Your restraint back then is a significant part of why our own reunion succeeded as fully as it did. I trust you will carry that same restraint into whatever we find at the tidebound's shores." The territory itself, once the expedition finally arrived at its coastal edge, proved striking in ways that immediately confirmed the merchant's original account, a stretch of shoreline considerably calmer and more temperate than the surrounding coastline's natural volatility should have permitted, fishing villages thriving along waters that, according to Fenna's careful lay readings, carried the unmistakable signature of deliberate, sustained magical stabilization. "It is genuine," she confirmed, studying her readings with the same focused intensity she brought to every significant magical assessment. "A Covenant bloodline's influence, considerably similar in structure to our own, though the underlying current it stabilizes runs through water rather than earth. Whatever the tidebound's true relationship to House Marlowe, their gift itself is entirely authentic, and has clearly been maintained faithfully enough to keep this entire coastline productive and safe for generations. House Marlowe's own estate, when the expedition finally approached it under the careful, formal pretense of simple diplomatic visitors rather than any overt challenge to the territory's established order, proved considerably grander than anything the merchant's account had suggested, and it was there, observing the estate's staff and the wider territory's social arrangements with careful, patient attention over the following days, that Eleanor and her party began to properly understand the full, insidious shape of exactly what several generations of careful, systematic control had actually built. "They do not look chained," Offrey's observed quietly, watching a group of tie-bound workers moving through the estate's grounds with the particular, resigned efficiency of people who had simply never been shown any alternative existed. "That is what makes this considerably harder to address than House Verith, or even House Corvain ever was. There is no ledger documenting a massacre here, no single dramatic crime to expose before a council. There is only generations of quiet, patient limitation, dressed carefully enough in tradition and convenience that even the tie-bound themselves may not fully recognize it as the injustice it actually is. The first genuine contact with a tie-bound resident came not through any formal introduction House Marlowe staff arranged, but through quiet, deliberate patience, Eleanor spending several days simply present in the coastal village nearest the estate, asking careful, respectful questions of the fishing families who lived there, listening considerably more than she spoke, until a young tie-bound woman named Coraline, drawn by curiosity about the visiting party's unusual, gentle interest, finally approached her directly. "You ask questions differently than the merchants and scholars who sometimes visit," Coraline observed, studying Eleanor with the same careful, evaluating caution Issei recognized from every previous survivor's first hesitant steps toward trust. "Most simply want to understand our gift well enough to properly value the trade goods it protects. You seem to want to understand us." "That is precisely what I want," Eleanor said honestly. "I am something like kin to your people, Coraline, though I did not understand that until recently myself. My own bloodline carries a similar gift, tied to the land rather than the water, and my own people survived something considerably darker than what I have witnessed here, before we found our way toward a very different kind of life. I did not come here to disrupt whatever arrangement your people currently understand as ordinary. I came because I wondered whether you might want to know that other arrangements exist, should you ever wish to consider them." Coraline's expression, hearing this, carried a complicated mixture of confusion and something considerably more cautious, the particular wariness of someone confronting, for the first time, the possibility that her entire understood world might not represent the only way such things could properly work. "I do not fully understand what you are suggesting," she admitted. "My family has served House Marlowe's coastal stewardship for as long as anyone can remember. It is simply what our people do. I do not know what an alternative would even look like." It was Fenna, listening from a respectful distance, who finally stepped forward to share something of her own experience, her voice carrying the particular gentle authority of someone who had walked a similar path of discovery herself. "I grew up entirely ignorant of my own heritage," she said. "Raised by a human family who protected me from a truth they believed too dangerous to share. I did not know, until only a few years ago, that an entire restored people existed, people who had rebuilt their lives, their traditions, their genuine freedom, after surviving something that once nearly destroyed them completely. I do not say this to tell you what your own life should look like. I say it because I understand better than most exactly how strange and disorienting it feels to first learn that other possibilities exist beyond whatever limited world you were raised to accept as simply, inevitably normal." Coraline's expression, absorbing this account, carried visible, careful consideration, and over the following days, word of the visiting party's gentle, patient presence in the village spread steadily among the tie-bound community, more residents approaching cautiously to share fragments of their own experience, their own quiet, unspoken frustrations with an arrangement most had never previously had language or context to properly name as unjust. House Marlowe's response to this growing, quiet interest, when it finally arrived, came not through direct confrontation but through the same careful, indirect pressure the household had learned to recognize from every previous house determined to protect a comfortable, exploitative status quo, formal complaints lodged with the local magistrate about outside agitators disturbing the region's traditional order. Subtle restrictions placed on the village's trade privileges, and most troublingly, a formal summons delivered to Eleanor herself, requesting her immediate departure alongside a pointed reminder that House Marlowe's authority within this territory remained, whatever her own counsel's distant influence might suggest, entirely uncontested. Eleanor read the summons with the same hard, controlled fury Issei had seen her direct at Malbrant, Castellan, and every other calculating power who had ever attempted to treat her people, or now the tie-bound, as simple resources to be managed rather than people deserving genuine respect. "They want us gone before the tie-bound have a proper chance to consider what we have actually offered them," she said. "That tells me everything I need to know about how confident House Marlowe genuinely feels regarding the fairness of their own arrangement." "Then we do not simply leave," Issei said, the same protective resolve that had first carried him into a forest clearing years earlier settling firmly into his chest once more. "We finish what we came here to do, carefully and honestly, exactly the way we've done everything else. House Marlowe doesn't get to decide this conversation ends just because it's become inconvenient for them. The formal confrontation with House Marlowe, when it finally became unavoidable, took place not at the estate itself but in the coastal village's own modest gathering hall, Eleanor having insisted, over the objections of House Marlowe's own steward, that any discussion regarding the Tidebound's future take place on ground the Tidebound themselves considered home, rather than within the estate's imposing, unequal walls. Lord Marlowe himself, a heavy-set man whose careful, cultivated charm reminded Issei uncomfortably of Malbrant's own oily political manner, arrived with a small retinue of house guards and legal advisers, his expression carrying the particular, practiced condescension of someone entirely unaccustomed to having his territory's arrangements seriously questioned. "I confess I do not understand what precisely you believe you are accomplishing here," he said, addressing Eleanor with poorly disguised impatience. "My family has stewarded this coastline for 6 generations. The Tidebound flourish under our protection, their gift properly honored and maintained, their people fed, housed, and safe from the considerable dangers a less carefully managed coastline would otherwise present. I fail to see what grievance an outside party, however well-intentioned, believes it has standing to raise on their behalf." Eleanor's response carried none of the hesitation Lord Marlowe's dismissive tone might have reasonably invited. "I raised no grievance on their behalf," she said. "I raised only a simple question, addressed directly to the Tidebound themselves, gathered here today to answer it in their own words rather than have it answered for them by a house that has spent 6 generations deciding what counts as their flourishing. Do you consider yourselves free, in the fullest sense, to leave this arrangement, to seek education, wealth, or opportunity beyond what House Marlowe currently permits, should you ever wish to?" The silence that followed carried a weight Issei felt settle heavily over the entire gathered hall. Dozens of Tidebound residents, drawn by word of the confrontation, exchanging careful, uncertain glances, the particular silence of people confronting a question they had genuinely never been permitted to properly consider before this exact moment. It was Coraline, standing near the hall's edge with visible, trembling courage, who finally broke that silence. "No," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its obvious fear. "I do not believe we are free in that sense. I have never known any other life, Lord Marlowe. I have never been offered the choice to no one. I did not understand, until this woman arrived and simply asked me honest questions, that such a choice was even something I was permitted to want." Lord Marlowe's composed expression cracked visibly at this public challenge, his careful charm giving way to something considerably colder and more calculating. "You are being manipulated," he said sharply, addressing Coraline directly. "This outside party arrives, spends a handful of days filling your head with foreign ideas about freedom and choice, and expects you to abandon 6 generations of stable, prosperous tradition on the strength of a few carefully chosen questions." "I am not manipulating anyone," Eleanor said, her voice cutting cleanly across Lord Marlowe's mounting anger. "I am asking questions your own arrangement has never permitted the Tidebound to properly ask themselves. If your stewardship is truly as fair and beneficial as you claim, Lord Marlowe, it should survive the simple test of the Tidebound being genuinely, fully informed of their actual alternatives, and choosing, freely, to remain regardless. If it cannot survive that test, I would suggest the fault lies with the arrangement itself, not with anyone honest enough to finally ask the question aloud." The gathered hall's tension stretched taut for a long, suspended moment, and it was Lord Marlowe's own steward, an older man who had remained carefully silent throughout the confrontation, who finally spoke into that tension with a weariness that suggested considerably more internal conflict than his employer's confident bluster had allowed him to previously voice. "My lord," he said quietly, "I have served this house faithfully for 30 years. I have also watched, for 30 years, the Tidebound denied every genuine opportunity our own family's children take entirely for granted. I do not say this lightly, nor without real fear for my own position. But I do not believe, listening to what has been said here today, that I can continue pretending our arrangement represents anything other than exactly what this visitor has named it. I believe, whatever it costs this house's standing, the Tidebound deserve the genuine choice being offered to them." Lord Marlowe's steward's public break from his employer's carefully maintained authority sent a visible ripple through the gathered hall, several other tie-bound residents finding, in his quiet courage, the confidence to voice their own long-suppressed frustrations, and Lord Marlowe himself, watching his careful, generations-old arrangement visibly unraveling before an audience he had never expected to seriously question it, finally abandoned his earlier condescending composure entirely. "This is not a matter for a village hall to decide," he said, his voice carrying open anger now rather than practiced charm. "This territory answers to considerably older legal arrangements than whatever informal appeal to sentiment you are attempting to stage here today." "Then let us settle it through exactly those proper legal channels," Rhea said, stepping forward with the same sharp, formal authority she had brought to every previous confrontation with an established house's entrenched power. "My own house maintains standing before the Regional Council, Lord Marlowe, the same council whose authority governs matters of bloodline exploitation and unjust territorial arrangement across considerably more established houses than your own. I would be very surprised if a formal inquest into 6 generations of systematic dependency, deliberately maintained to deny an entire covenant bloodline genuine autonomy, did not draw exactly the kind of scrutiny your family has apparently spent considerable effort avoiding until now." Lord Marlowe's expression, hearing this direct threat of formal inquest, carried a visible flicker of genuine fear beneath his mounting anger, and it was in that flicker, Issei recognized, watching the confrontation's balance shift decisively, the same tell he had seen from Castellan and House Verith alike, a powerful man discovering, for the first time, that his careful control of a situation had genuinely, irreversibly slipped beyond his grasp. The formal negotiations that followed over the subsequent weeks, conducted with Rhea's careful diplomatic guidance and considerable pressure from the wider regional council once Warden Cash's own order formally confirmed the Tidebound's covenant bloodline status, ultimately produced an agreement considerably more thorough than even Eleanor had initially hoped to secure. House Marlowe's exclusive control over Tidebound labor and resources formally dissolved, replaced by a proper compensation. An education framework negotiated directly with Tidebound representatives themselves, and a formal acknowledgement, entered into the Regional Council's own record, of the systematic dependency the arrangement had maintained across 6 generations. "It is not the same reckoning House Verith, or even House Corvain faced," Eleanor observed to Issei, watching the formal agreement's final signing from the coastal village's own gathering hall, considerably more crowded and hopeful now than it had been during the initial confrontation weeks earlier. "There was no single massacre here, no single ledger of documented atrocity. Only generations of quiet limitation, dressed carefully enough in tradition that even naming it properly required considerable, deliberate work. I believe that makes this reckoning, in its own way, just as significant as anything we have accomplished before, perhaps more so, precisely because it required us to recognize injustice that never announced itself through violence or open cruelty." Coraline, approaching the small gathering with an expression that carried the particular, disbelieving wonder Issei had seen on every previous survivor's face upon first tasting genuine freedom, embraced Eleanor with fierce, grateful warmth. "I do not yet know what my life will actually look like, now that the choice genuinely exists," she admitted. "I find that considerably more frightening than I expected freedom to feel. But I would rather face that uncertain fear than continue living a life I never actually chose for myself." "That fear passes," Eleanor said gently, echoing the same reassurance Marin had once offered her own uncertain people years earlier. "It becomes, in time, simply the ordinary texture of a life genuinely, freely your own. I promise you, Coraline, it is worth every uncertain moment it takes to properly settle into the formal establishment of a tie-bound council, drawing on both Rhea's own diplomatic guidance and Marin's careful experience helping the Hollow navigate its own transition from isolated tradition toward genuine self-determination, began within days of House Marlowe's formal agreement, and as the expedition finally prepared for its own long journey home weeks later, Eleanor found herself reflecting, watching the coastal village's new council conduct its very first independent meeting, on exactly how far this particular thread of her restoration's remarkable, ever-expanding story had traveled from its own quiet beginning in a single forest clearing so many years before. The journey home carried the expedition through the same considerable distance that had marked their original passage east, though the mood accompanying it carried none of the careful, uncertain tension of their outward journey, replaced instead by the particular, satisfied weariness of difficult, worthwhile work properly completed. Coraline, having asked to accompany the party for at least an initial visit to the settlement herself, curious about exactly what a fully realized covenant bloodline restoration actually looked like in practice, spent much of the journey peppering Fenna and Eleanor alike with careful, earnest questions about everything from the settlement's school curriculum to the practical realities of self-governance the Tidebound's own new council would soon need to properly navigate. I do not think I fully understood, watching your own people's restoration only from a distance through Fenna's careful description, exactly how much patient, ordinary work goes into building something like your settlement, she admitted one evening, watching the unfamiliar western stars with the same wondering curiosity she had shown throughout the entire journey. I confess I imagined freedom itself as the finish line. I am beginning to understand it is closer to a beginning. That is precisely right, Eleanor said, settling beside her with the easy warmth she had shown every previous survivor navigating this same difficult, hopeful transition. Freedom is not the destination, Coraline. It is simply the necessary foundation that finally makes building the actual life you want possible. My own people spent 5 years, and counting, doing exactly that work, one patient, ordinary, sometimes difficult choice at a time. I do not say that to discourage you. I say it because I believe your own people deserve to understand, honestly, exactly what the road ahead will actually require, rather than a comfortable illusion that freedom alone solves everything instantly and completely. It was during this same journey home that Warden Kasha, who had remained at the settlement overseeing the Covenant's continued monitoring during the expedition's absence, sent word through Aquino's swift channels carrying news that added an unexpected new dimension to everything the household had just accomplished with the Tidebound's liberation. The Tidebound's Covenant, once properly freed from House Marlowe's coercive management, appears to be strengthening considerably faster than our Order's models predicted, her message reported. Preliminary readings suggest their bloodline gift, no longer constrained by generations of extractive management, is beginning to stabilize coastal currents across a considerably wider territory than House Marlowe's own boundaries ever properly claimed. I believe this confirms something our Order has long suspected but never previously had clear evidence to properly demonstrate, that Covenant bloodlines maintained through genuine, free choice consistently outperform those maintained through coercion or extraction, regardless of how carefully such coercive arrangements are managed. Varen, reading this report with visible, scholarly satisfaction, shared its implications with the gathered party during one of their final evenings on the road home. This is significant beyond simply confirming what we already believed about the Tidebound's own situation, he said. If Warden Kasha's order can properly document and demonstrate this pattern, freely chosen stewardship consistently outperforming coercive extraction, it provides considerable additional leverage for identifying and challenging similar arrangements wherever else they may exist. Not merely a moral argument for justice, though that argument has always mattered a great deal to this household. A practical, demonstrable argument that even the most cynical, self-interested house cannot easily dismiss. Eleanor, listening to this analysis with the same thoughtful, considering attention she brought to every significant development, felt the shape of her restoration's continuing story settling into something considerably larger than even the Tidebound's own remarkable liberation had first suggested. Then perhaps this becomes part of what we teach, going forward, she said. Not merely our own history, though that will always remain central to everything the settlement's school properly preserves. A broader understanding of exactly what Covenant bloodlines are meant to accomplish, and exactly why coercion, however comfortably it may be dressed in generations of convenient tradition, ultimately fails both the bloodline itself and the wider land it is meant to faithfully serve. The homecoming, when the expedition finally arrived back at the settlement after nearly 2 months away, carried the same overwhelming warmth Issei had come to expect from every previous significant return, though this time it carried an added layer of curious wonder, the settlement's residents gathering eagerly to properly meet Coraline, the first genuine representative of an entirely different Covenant bloodline any of them had ever encountered in person. Corin, now old enough to form full, if occasionally rambling sentences, greeted his returning parents with the same delighted, uncomplicated joy he always showed, though it was his enthusiastic, immediate curiosity about Coraline specifically, tugging at her sleeve to ask whether she could really talk to the ocean the way his mother talked to the garden's roots, that drew the first genuine, easy laugh from their exhausted but happy guest. "I do not know yet whether I can properly talk to anything," Coraline admitted, crouching down to meet the small boy's earnest, curious gaze. "I am still learning what my own gift is actually capable of, now that I am finally free to explore it properly rather than simply having it managed for me. Perhaps you can help me find out." Corin's delighted, immediate agreement to this proposal set the tone for Coraline's following weeks within the settlement, Sable taking her under careful, patient guidance alongside her usual work with Fenna, and it was during one such training session, watching Coraline successfully draw her first genuine, deliberate response from a nearby stream rather than the passive, managed stability house Marlowe's arrangement had always simply extracted from her without her conscious participation, that Eleanor found herself struck by the particular, quiet wonder of watching an entirely new bloodline's restoration begin to properly take root. "It responds differently than our own gift," Sable observed, studying Coraline's careful, tentative connection to the stream's gentle current with scholarly fascination. "More fluid, less rooted, which I suppose makes perfect sense given the nature of what it stabilizes. I confess I am learning nearly as much watching Coraline's gift awaken properly as I once learned helping guide Fenna's own restoration." The Settlement's Council, meeting to discuss the broader implications of everything the tie-bound expedition had uncovered, ultimately settled on a framework considerably more ambitious than anything the community had previously attempted, a formal partnership not merely with the Tidebound's own newly independent council but with Warden Cash's order directly, establishing what Varen, drafting the framework's founding documents with visible excitement, began referring to as the Covenant Alliance, a loose but genuine network of restored and restoring bloodlines committed to sharing knowledge, resources, and support as more such communities were identified across the region's considerable, largely unmapped territories. "We are no longer simply one restoration among many possible futures," Rias observed during the Council's final discussion of the framework, her expression carrying the same careful, strategic satisfaction she had shown at every previous significant milestone. "We are becoming something closer to a template, a demonstrated proof that scattered, exploited, or forgotten bloodlines can find their way back to genuine wholeness, provided they are offered patience, honesty, and genuine partnership rather than simple rescue or convenient management." Eleanor, listening to this assessment with the same thoughtful weight she brought to every significant reflection on her people's remarkable journey, finally offered the same steady philosophy that had guided every previous chapter of the Restoration's long, difficult, ultimately triumphant story. "Then we continue exactly as we have always continued," she said. "Patiently, honestly, and never forgetting that every single person and bloodline we encounter deserves to be met as a genuine partner in their own restoration, not simply a project for us to complete on their behalf. That is, I believe, the truest lesson my own people's 15 years of grief and 5 years of rebuilding have ultimately taught me, and I intend to carry it forward into whatever new chapters this Alliance's continued work still has waiting for us." The months following the Tidebound's liberation carried the settlement through a season of steady, expanding purpose, the newly formed Covenant Alliance drawing formal interest from several other territories whose own historical records, once properly examined through Warden Cash's orders, now considerably sharper understanding of what to actually look for, began revealing fragmentary hints of other scattered or exploited Covenant bloodlines waiting, in various states of need, to be properly found. Fenna, whose scholarly partnership with Warden Cash's order had grown into something like a formal vocation in its own right, took primary responsibility for coordinating the Alliance's careful, methodical research efforts, and it was during one of her regular reports to the Settlement's Council that she raised a development carrying considerably more immediate weight than the usual steady trickle of historical leads. "We have identified a third bloodline," she reported, spreading a modest collection of notes across the council table with visible, careful excitement. "Considerably harder to trace than either our own restoration or the Tidebound situation, given how thoroughly scattered the fragmentary records suggest they became. Unlike the Tidebound, who remained concentrated under a single house's management. This bloodline appears to have been deliberately, systematically dispersed across multiple territories generations ago, similar in structure to what nearly happened to our own people after the massacre, though apparently sustained and enforced considerably longer. Varen, reviewing the same fragmentary notes with his usual sharp historical focus, carried an expression that mixed scholarly fascination with grave concern. If this bloodline has remained scattered for generations rather than mere years, he said slowly, its members may have lost considerably more of their own history and identity than even Fena experienced before her own restoration began. This would not be a rescue mission in the same sense as the Tidebound's liberation. It would be something closer to what Eleanor's own party undertook in the earliest days, seeking scattered survivors who may not even fully understand what they are looking for themselves. Eleanor, listening to this assessment with the same careful, weighted attention she brought to every significant new challenge, felt the particular, familiar resolve that had carried her through every previous chapter of her people's remarkable restoration settle steadily into her chest once more. Then we approach it exactly the way we approached our own restoration's earliest days, she said. Patiently, and without presuming we already understand what these scattered people actually need before we have properly listened to them. It was during this same period of careful, expanding purpose that the household received news of a considerably more personal nature, Eleanor discovering, several months after their return from the Tidebound expedition, that she was once again carrying a child, news that drew the same overwhelming, joyful celebration from the settlement that Corin's own arrival had once inspired, tempered now by the particular, settled confidence of a family who understood, considerably more thoroughly than during their first pregnancy, exactly how much genuine safety and community now surrounded this new arrival's coming into the world. I did not expect, standing here now, to feel quite so differently than I did carrying Corin, Eleanor admitted to Issei one quiet evening, her hand resting gently over the earliest, still barely noticeable signs of her pregnancy. I remember the old fear so vividly from those early months, the worry that I was bringing a child into a world that had once tried so thoroughly to erase our entire bloodline. I do not feel that fear this time, not in any way that weighs heavily. I feel only anticipation, and gratitude, and the particular, settled joy of knowing exactly how much love and safety already surrounds whoever we are fortunate enough to welcome next. Issei, watching her with the same steady, devoted warmth that had carried him through every remarkable chapter of their shared life together, felt his own heart settle into the same quiet, contented certainty. That's the whole restoration working exactly the way it's supposed to, he said, smiling. Not just surviving anymore. Building a life so genuinely safe that bringing a new person into it feels like pure joy instead of old fear. I think that might be the truest measure of everything we've actually built these past 5 years. The months of Eleanor's second pregnancy unfolded alongside the Covenant Alliance's steadily deepening work, Fena and Warden Cash's order continuing their careful, methodical research into the scattered bloodline's fragmentary trail even as the settlement's own daily rhythms carried forward with the same patient, ordinary warmth that had come to define its hard-won peace. Corin, delighted at the prospect of a sibling, spent considerable time discussing, with the earnest seriousness only a small child could properly muster, exactly what responsibilities he intended to take on as an older brother, most of which, to Eleanor's visible amusement, involved teaching the new arrival everything Thessaly had so far taught him about proper sword forms. Regardless of how many years away any actual practice remained, it was during this same season that Coraline, having spent nearly a year dividing her time between the settlement and her own Tidebound community's continued transition, made a decision that carried considerable weight for both communities, formally requesting to establish permanent residence within the settlement itself, while maintaining close, regular contact with her own people's newly independent council. I do not abandon my own community by choosing this, she explained carefully to Eleanor, who had listened to the request with the same careful, respectful attention she extended to every significant choice a survivor made regarding their own future. I simply find, having witnessed what a fully realized restoration actually looks like in practice, that I want to help build something similar for my own people, and I believe I can do that most effectively by learning everything this settlement has to teach, the same patient way Fenna and Sable once learned to properly cultivate our shared bloodline gift's deeper potential. Eleanor's answering embrace carried the same warm, unconditional welcome she had extended to every previous arrival who had found their way to the settlement's protection, and Coraline's formal integration into the community, celebrated with a modest but genuine gathering beneath the settlement's now considerably expanded central square, marked, Varen noted in his careful ongoing archive, the first formal instance of the Restoration's growing tradition extending its welcome beyond the Duskwood bloodline itself, a genuine, deliberate step toward the broader vision of partnership and shared purpose the Covenant Alliance had begun to represent. Eleanor's labor, when it finally began on a mild autumn evening nearly identical in its quiet, ordinary beauty to the one that had once brought Corin into the world, proceeded with considerably less anxious uncertainty than her first experience. Asia's now thoroughly practiced care guiding the birth with steady, confident skill. And it was well past midnight when the settlement finally received the news it had been eagerly awaiting, a healthy daughter, born safely into a family and community that had, in the years since Corin's own arrival, only grown more thoroughly, joyfully prepared to welcome her. They named her Wilhelmina, though the household quickly settled into calling her simply Willa, a name Eleanor explained carried old Duskwood roots meaning something close to the one who mends, chosen deliberately to honor the particular, ongoing work of restoration and reconciliation that had come to define so much of the family's remarkable life together since her own birth into a considerably harder, more uncertain world. She carries a different kind of promise than her brother did, Eleanor told Issei quietly, watching their daughter sleep peacefully in the same warm, golden evening light that had once marked Corin's own arrival years earlier. Corin was born as proof that our restoration had survived its hardest trials. Wella is born into something considerably larger already, a whole alliance beginning to form, other bloodlines finding their way home alongside our own. I find myself wondering, watching her sleep, exactly what kind of world she will grow up to help build, considering how much larger this story has already grown beyond anything either of us imagined when we first stood together in that forest clearing. Issei, settling beside her with the same steady, devoted love that had carried him through every remarkable chapter of their shared life, felt the full weight of that wondering settle warmly into his own chest. Whatever it turns out to be, he said, she's going to grow up exactly the way Corin has, surrounded by people who love her, safe enough to actually wonder about the future instead of just surviving it. I think that's the best gift either of us could possibly give either of our kids, whatever specific shape their own part of this story eventually takes. The following months carried the settlement through the particular, double joy of two young children growing alongside a community that continued expanding steadily in both population and purpose, Wella's infancy unfolding with the same abundant, communal attention Corin's own early years had drawn, while the Covenant Alliance's careful research into the scattered third bloodline continued its slow, methodical progress under Fenna and Warden Cash's patient guidance. It was nearly 6 months after Willa's birth that Fenna finally brought a breakthrough to the settlement's council, her expression carrying the particular, focused excitement of a scholar who had finally assembled enough fragmentary evidence to properly act. We have traced the scattered bloodline's descendants to at least 4 distinct territories, she reported, spreading a considerably more detailed map across the council table than her earlier, tentative research had allowed. Unlike the tie-bound, there is no single house or authority actively exploiting them. They simply do not know what they are, generations of displacement having erased even the basic knowledge of their own shared heritage. I do not believe this bloodline requires liberation in the way the tie-bound did. I believe it requires something closer to what happened when Solene first arrived at our own gate: patient outreach, careful education, and the genuine, unhurried offer of reunion. Eleanor, listening to this assessment with the same thoughtful weight she brought to every significant new challenge, considered the practical scope of what such an effort would actually require. 4 separate territories, she said slowly. That is considerably more complex than a single expedition can properly manage, especially with Wella still so young and the settlement's own ongoing work requiring careful, continued attention. It was Marin, present at the council meeting as part of the Hollow's now regular participation in the settlement's significant decisions, who offered the practical solution that ultimately shaped the Alliance's next chapter. Then this need not fall to your family alone, she said. The Hollow has spent considerable time learning from your own restoration's example these past years. I believe we are ready to take on genuine responsibility within this covenant alliance ourselves, rather than simply supporting your own efforts from a comfortable distance. Let the Hollow's own council coordinate outreach to one or two of these territories directly, drawing on everything we have learned from both our own reunion and the Tidebound's liberation. Rias, considering this proposal with visible, strategic approval, nodded thoughtfully. That is precisely the kind of distributed structure this alliance will need if it hopes to grow sustainably, she said. We cannot properly serve as the sole coordinating force behind every scattered bloodline's restoration, not without stretching the settlement's own considerable but finite resources well beyond what any single community should reasonably bear. Let the Hollow, the Tidebound, and our own settlement each take genuine, independent responsibility for different threads of this work, coordinated through the Alliance's shared framework but never dependent entirely on any single community's continued effort. The Council's subsequent planning, spanning the following weeks, ultimately divided the scattered bloodlines for identified territories among the Alliance's 3 founding communities, the Hollow taking responsibility for the 2 territories geographically closest to their own mountain paths, the settlement retaining direct oversight of the most historically significant lead, and the Tidebound, still early in their own transition but eager to demonstrate genuine capability, taking on the 4th territory with careful, direct support from both Eleanor's own settlement and Warden Cash's order. Watching this careful, distributed plan take shape during the Council's final session, Eleanor felt a particular, quiet satisfaction settle over her that carried none of the anxious urgency of the restoration's earliest years, only the steady, hard-won confidence of a community that had grown genuinely capable of sharing its hardest, most meaningful work rather than carrying it alone. We are no longer simply my people's restoration, she observed to Issei that evening, watching Wella sleep peacefully in her small bed while Corin practiced his forms with visible determination in the next room. We have become something considerably larger, a genuine alliance of restored peoples, each capable of extending exactly the kind of patient, honest welcome we were once so fortunate to receive ourselves. The settlement's role as the Covenant Alliance's founding and most experienced member brought with it a steady stream of visiting delegations over the following months, representatives from the Hollow and the Tidebound alike traveling regularly to observe and learn from the practical, patient systems Sable, Thessaly, and the rest of the settlement's core teachers had spent years carefully refining, and it was during one such visit, hosting a small delegation from the Tidebound's own newly formed Education Council, that Eleanor found herself reflecting on exactly how thoroughly her own restoration's hard-won lessons had begun rippling outward into something considerably larger than she had ever imagined possible. You have built something remarkable here, one of the visiting Tidebound representatives observed, watching the settlement's school conduct its afternoon lessons with visible admiration, children from at least 3 distinct bloodlines now studying alongside each other in the same classrooms, their lessons woven carefully together from Duskwood tradition, Tidebound coastal knowledge, and the practical education every child would need regardless of heritage. I confess I did not expect, when Coraline first suggested we might learn from your example, quite how thoroughly integrated your community's teaching would become. That integration was never planned from the very beginning, Eleanor admitted honestly. It grew, gradually, the same patient way everything else in the settlement has grown, one deliberate choice at a time, as we welcomed each new family and asked ourselves, honestly, what kind of community we actually wanted to build together, rather than simply preserving whatever separate traditions each arrival brought with them in careful isolation from one another. It was during this same period that Warden Kasha, whose orders continued partnership with the settlement had deepened into something considerably closer to genuine friendship than the careful, formal alliance of their earliest acquaintance, brought news that carried the particular weight of a discovery considerably larger than even the scattered bloodline's own significant scope. My order's continued study of Covenant bloodlines across the region's history has uncovered something I believe deserves your immediate, careful attention, she told Eleanor and Issei during one of her regular visits to the settlement, her expression carrying a gravity that immediately sharpened their attention. We have identified references, scattered across several considerably older historical fragments, suggesting the deep current your own covenant helps stabilize connects, at a level our order has never before properly mapped, to similar foundational structures beneath other regions entirely, territories well beyond even the considerable reach the Covenant Alliance currently maintains. Eleanor's expression, absorbing this revelation, carried the same careful, dawning weight that had marked every previous significant discovery of her restoration's remarkable journey. "You are suggesting our covenant is not merely one isolated bond," she said slowly, "but part of something considerably larger, an entire network of foundational stewardship stretching across territories none of us have yet properly explored." "I believe so," Warden Cassius said carefully. "Though I want to be clear that my order's understanding remains genuinely incomplete. We do not yet know how many such covenant networks exist, nor how directly connected they truly are to your own bloodline's specific stewardship. I raise this not as an immediate crisis requiring urgent action, the way the original seal's weakening once did, but as a possibility your restoration may wish to begin considering, thoughtfully and at whatever pace feels genuinely sustainable, given everything else this alliance is already responsibly managing." Issei, listening to this latest revelation with the same steady, settled readiness that 5 remarkable years had taught him to bring to whatever new chapter their extraordinary life together continued to reveal, felt the familiar shape of expanding purpose settle comfortably rather than anxiously into his own understanding of exactly what their family's future still held in store. "Sounds like the story just keeps getting bigger," he said, smiling at Eleanor with the same warm, steady love that had carried them through every remarkable turn of their shared journey. "Good thing we've got 2 kids, a whole alliance, and about 5 years of hard-won experience figuring out how to take these things one patient step at a time." Eleanor's answering smile carried the full, settled confidence of a woman who had long since learned to trust exactly that patient, deliberate process, however large the story continued to grow around her. "Then let us take this next step exactly the same way we have taken every step before it," she said. "Together, honestly, and without ever forgetting that the truest measure of any restoration is not how quickly it grows, but how faithfully it holds the people already gathered within it while it does." The evening following Warden Cash's departure, Issei found himself once more beneath the persimmon tree, watching Eleanor settle Willa into sleep while Corin, now old enough to insist on staying up slightly later than his sister, sat cross-legged beside them practicing the careful, patient breathing exercises Thessaly had recently begun teaching him as a foundation for the forms he was so eager to properly master. "You are thinking about what Warden Cassius said," Eleanor observed, once Willa had finally drifted fully into sleep and Corin had been persuaded, with only mild protest, toward his own bed. "I am," Issei admitted. "Not worried exactly. Just turning it over. Every time I think we've reached some kind of settled place, something reminds me the story's still got more room to grow than either of us probably ever imagined back in that forest." Eleanor considered this, settling beside him in the garden's familiar, comfortable quiet. "Do you resent that?" she asked, genuinely curious rather than defensive. "The way this has never quite settled into something simple and finished, the way perhaps you once imagined an ordinary life might?" Issei thought about the question seriously, the way he considered very little else in his life beyond her. "No," he said finally. "I don't think I do. I used to imagine, way back before any of this started, that an ordinary life meant nothing ever really changing. I don't believe that anymore. I think an ordinary life is just whatever shape your actual days take, however big or small that shape turns out to be, as long as you're building it with people you love, one deliberate choice at a time. That's true whether we're just tending our own garden or coordinating a whole alliance of restored bloodlines. The scale changes. The actual, ordinary work of choosing each other every day doesn't." Eleanor's answering smile carried the same warm, settled peace that had become so wonderfully familiar across their years together, and she leaned into him, watching the garden's ancient, patient magic pulse gently in the deepening evening dark. "Then I believe I have found, sitting here with you tonight, the truest answer to Warden Cash's revelation," she said. "Whatever this deeper network of covenants ultimately turns out to be, however far this story's roots eventually reach, we meet it exactly the way we have met everything else. Patiently, honestly, and never allowing the scale of what we are building to overshadow the simple, ordinary love that has carried us here in the first place." The following weeks carried the settlement through its usual, steady rhythm, the Council's careful planning for the scattered bloodlines' 4 territories proceeding alongside the ordinary, daily work of raising 2 young children in a community that had, over 6 remarkable years, grown from a single desperate garden into something considerably larger and more hopeful than anyone involved in its earliest days could have properly imagined. Varen, continuing his careful, ongoing documentation of the restoration's every significant milestone, began, during this period, drafting what he described to Eleanor as the first proper history intended not merely for the settlement's own archive, but for eventual sharing across the wider Covenant alliance. A comprehensive account meant to help every restored or restoring bloodline understand exactly how patient, honest rebuilding could transform even the deepest grief into genuine, lasting hope. I want the children of every community within this alliance to read this history someday, he explained to Eleanor, showing her his careful early drafts with visible pride. Not simply your own people's story, though that remains its proper foundation. The whole, expanding story, the Hollow's reunion, the Tidebound's liberation, whatever new chapters this scattered bloodline's own restoration eventually adds to it. I want them to understand, reading it, that whatever grief or exploitation their own ancestors once survived, patient, honest choosing can genuinely, eventually transform it into something worth the considerable cost of the journey. Eleanor, reading through his careful early pages with visible, moved gratitude, felt the full weight of everything the preceding 6 years had built settle warmly into her chest once more. Then let us make certain this history stays honest all the way through, she said. Not simply our triumphs, though I am proud of every one of them. Our mistakes too, our fears, the moments we did not know whether we would succeed. I believe that honesty will matter more to whatever scattered bloodline eventually reads it than any comfortable, simplified version of our story ever could. It was on a bright, ordinary morning some weeks later, the settlement's usual gentle rhythm unfolding around them, market stalls opening along the central square, children making their way toward the school's morning lessons, that the first genuine word arrived from the Hollow's own outreach effort into the scattered bloodlines' territories, carried by a messenger whose excited, hurried pace immediately drew the attention of everyone she passed. We found them, the messenger reported, once she had been brought before Eleanor and the settlement's assembled council, her voice still catching from the urgency of her journey. Not merely traces or fragments this time. A genuine community, considerably smaller than either our own settlement or the Tidebound's own numbers, but real, gathered together in a remote mountain valley not unlike the Hollow's own original hiding place, though they do not call themselves by the old bloodline name our research suggested. They call themselves simply the Kindred, and they know almost nothing of their own deeper history, only that their small community has always felt, in ways they never properly understood, connected to the land around them in some manner other communities did not seem to share. Eleanor's expression, hearing this, carried the same careful, hopeful weight that had marked every previous discovery of scattered kin across the Restoration's remarkable years. How did they receive the Hollow's approach, she asked. Cautiously, the messenger said. Though not with hostility. Marin herself is there now, working with the same patient care she once extended to our own settlement's original outreach, and she asked me to carry word back immediately, believing you would want to know as soon as possible, given everything your own bloodline's history has taught about the value of moving thoughtfully rather than urgently in matters this delicate. Varen, listening with visible, scholarly excitement, could not fully contain his enthusiasm even amid the council's careful, measured response. If this kindred community has preserved even fragmentary connection to their own bloodline gift without properly understanding its origin, he said, they may represent something genuinely unique among everything the Covenant Alliance has encountered so far, a community that survived complete historical erasure, and yet somehow retained the gift itself, purely through unbroken, if unconscious, generational practice. Eleanor considered this with the same thoughtful weight she brought to every significant new development, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the settled, patient confidence that 6 remarkable years of restoration had taught her to bring to even the most extraordinary new possibility. Then let Marin continue exactly as she has begun, she said. Patiently, honestly, and without rushing toward any conclusion these kindred have not yet had the proper chance to choose for themselves. I trust her judgment completely in this. We will offer whatever support she requests, and we will wait, exactly as we once waited for the Hollow's own careful consideration, for whatever answer the kindred themselves ultimately decide to give. That evening, gathered once more beneath the persimmon tree with Corin practicing his forms nearby and Wella sleeping peacefully in Eleanor's arms, Issei found himself struck, watching the ordinary, golden light settle over their small, extraordinary family, by the particular, quiet wonder of exactly how far this remarkable story had traveled since its own quiet, desperate beginning in a single forest clearing years earlier. Another thread, he said softly, watching the last light fade toward evening. Another thread, Eleanor agreed, her voice carrying the same fierce, hopeful resolve that had carried her through every previous chapter of her people's long, remarkable restoration. And I find, sitting here tonight, that I no longer fear how many more threads this story still has left to gather. I have learned, across 6 extraordinary years, that every single one of them, however unexpected, however far it eventually leads us, ultimately weaves back toward the same simple, unbreakable truth we discovered together in that ruined forest clearing so long ago. That connection, freely chosen and faithfully tended, can transform even the deepest grief into something worth every patient, difficult, ultimately triumphant step it takes to properly build. Issei pulled her gently closer, watching their children, their garden, and their whole hard-won, ever-expanding family settle into the warm, contented quiet of another ordinary evening, and felt, as he so often did on nights exactly like this one, the full, settled certainty that whatever new threads this remarkable story continued gathering, they would meet every single one of them exactly as they always had, patient, honest, and entirely, unshakably together. Word from Marin's continued work with the kindred arrived steadily over the following weeks, each report carrying the same patient, careful progress that had once marked the settlement's own original reunion with the Hollow. And it was during one such update, shared with the settlement's council on a quiet autumn afternoon, that Marin's own written account included a detail that struck Eleanor with particular, unexpected force. Their eldest, a woman named Perrin who serves as something like an informal elder despite the kindred having no formal governing structure of their own, asked me a question I did not expect, Marin's letter read. She asked whether the outside world, upon learning what her people apparently are, would try to take from them the small, quiet life they have built here, the way old stories her own grandmother once told suggested such discoveries always eventually ended. I told her, honestly, that I could not promise the wider world held no such danger in it. But I told her also that I could promise her something considerably more certain, that the Duskwood Restoration, and the alliance it has helped build, does not operate that way, and that she was welcome to send her own people to see that truth for themselves before deciding anything at all. Eleanor read this passage twice, her expression carrying the particular, complicated weight of old memory meeting new hope. That is precisely the fear I once carried myself, she said quietly, folding the letter carefully. Before Solene ever arrived at our own gate. I understand exactly what this parent is asking, because I once needed the exact same reassurance myself, and I understand exactly why Marin's answer was the only honest one worth giving. Issei, listening to her reflection with the same steady attention he brought to every quiet moment of genuine importance between them, felt the familiar shape of the restoration's deepest lesson settle once more into his own understanding. That's the whole thing, isn't it, he said? Not promising nobody out there will ever try to take advantage. Promising that here, in what we've actually built, that's never once been the answer, and letting people see that for themselves before asking them to trust it. Eleanor's answering nod carried the same settled, hard-won wisdom that had guided every chapter of her people's remarkable restoration, and as the autumn afternoon stretched toward evening, the settlement's ordinary rhythms continuing steadily around them, market stalls closing, children returning home from their lessons, the persimmon tree's leaves beginning their first gentle turn toward the season's change, she found herself, not for the first time, deeply grateful for exactly how far patient, honest choosing had carried her people, and exactly how much further it still promised to carry every new thread this remarkable story continued, faithfully, to gather. Thanks for listening.